World of Warcraft has been a cornerstone of the MMO genre for 2 decades, captivating millions of players with its expansive world, rich lore, and unforgettable adventures. But among all its sprawling continents and epic raids and intense battlegrounds, there's something that truly defines the experience for some players. From blades that have shaped Azeroth's history to artifacts imbued with raw power, weapons and armor in World of Warcraft aren't just tools of war. They're symbols of journeys taken and battles fought. In this video, we're going to take a dive into the most iconic weapons that have ever graced the game. Swords and staves and relics and armor sets that carry with them stories of triumph, betrayal, and heroism, whether it's the lore behind their creation, or the painstaking efforts it took to obtain them, or the way that they've become etched into the memories of millions of players. These items represent the very soul of World of Warcraft. So grab your sharpened blades and your enchanted tomes as we journey through 20 years of World of Warcraft's most fascinating and legendary armaments. For our first, we travel all the way back to the beginning of the game. One of the earliest and most iconic swords, Quel'Serrar. The ability to obtain this blade was removed in the Wrath of the Lich King expansion when they re-released the Onyxia's Lair raid. Some copies were made though, the burnished and gleaming Quel'Serrar, but the original and the quest to obtain it were lost forever. So what is this blade and why is it so special? I guess the best way to describe it is to read the official excerpt from the game itself. But before all of that, let's talk about an equally legendary blade, the Performance 5.0 Ultra package from Manscaped. 'Tis the season, the Mad Season, and this is the kind of gift that belongs under your tree and between your legs. First up, we've got the Lawnmower 5.0 Ultra. This bad boy tames even the wildest forests. It's got 2 interchangeable skin-safe blade heads for precision trimming, perfect for making your stocking stuffers look sharp. Plus, it has this larger LED spotlight, which lights up brighter than Rudolph's nose. And because it's waterproof, you can handle your business in the shower, cleanup is easy, and you can take care of your Yule log without leaving a mess. And once you've tidied up down there, don't forget about those stray branches poking out of your nose and ears with the Weed Whacker 2.0, which makes short work of those pesky hairs. After trimming the tree, you gotta keep those ornaments looking fresh. That's where the Crop Soother Aftershave Lotion and Crop Preserver Deodorant come in. No razor burn, no itchiness, just smooth and happy jingle bells ready to ring all season long. Plus, don't forget the 2 free gifts, the Boxers 2.0 and the Shed 2.0 travel bag, which is perfect for stashing all of your grooming tools. Use my code MSS20 at manscaped.com for 20% off, plus free international shipping, and keep your ornaments polished and ready for the season. Anyways, in ages past, well before even the War of the Ancients, there existed this blade. The blade itself had to be crafted in ceremony with the Children of the Aspects, a rare occurrence indeed, for not only would a dragon have to willingly heat and mold the enchanted metal with their breath, they would also need to contain the fury of their own enchantment by using their blood as temper. Over the course of 8,000 years, only a handful of these blades were created, each unique in both power and appearance. The blades of Quel'Serrar would take on the characteristics of their creator. Rumors exist of a single legendary blade of Quel'Serrar crafted for an unknown entity by the combined might of the 5 aspects. So if you didn't get that, it's legendary AF. So how and where did you actually get it in game? Well, the secret lies in the Diremaul dungeon. This used to be the ancient highborn city of Elder Thalas. It was built to protect Queen Ashar's secrets, and with her fall and the Sundering, the great city now lies in ruin, overrun with ogres and apparitions of the past. The denizens of these ruins, namely the bosses, had a chance to drop a tome titled For's Compendium of Dragon Slaying. It wasn't soulbound, so you could also just buy it off of the auction house, if you had the gold that is, and it was restricted to 2 classes, the warrior and the paladin, and upon use you would get a quest to find someone who can interpret the tome for you, and you would find such a person inside the Diremaul instance itself, located in the library. Lorekeeper Lydros thanks you for returning the tome, and suggests that a reward is in order, although it will require enormous effort to obtain. He would go on to explain the history behind the blade, like I went over earlier, and hands you a seemingly ordinary weapon, unfired, unheated, and untreated. This shadow of its former self is indeed Quel'Serrar. As explained earlier, the blades were created by the dragon aspects. They use their fire to heat them and their blood to temper them, so now that we have the blade, we need the dragon. But luckily, we're in luck because the daughter of the mad black dragonflight aspect, Neltharion, is of course Onyxia. The only problem is she won't voluntarily help create it, so the player must find a way to trick her. So at this point, you were given the Forging of Quel'Serrar quest, and you're also given an item called an Unfired Ancient Blade. So the next step was to head to the lair of Onyxia located in the Dustswallow Marsh in Kalimdor. You of course needed help, as this was a raid encounter, so you and 39 friends would engage the dragon in battle. You would need to coordinate with your allies, and mid-fight you had to actually use this blade to thrust it into the ground, and then position Onyxia in such a way that when she breathes her fire, she does so over the blade. So that was the heat covered. Now you just need some blood. So after it was heated, you had to pick it up from the ground to get the heated ancient blade, and from here, you had to kill Onyxia within 20 minutes before it cooled down. And if you failed, you had to start the quest over again, and most likely have to wait until the next reset before you could try again. So if you used it, the pressure was on and you had to do it successfully. But if you did succeed, you would then have to sink the blade into her corpse to treat it, and as a reward, you'd get the treated ancient blade. The last step was to return to Lord Keeper Lydros, and upon completion, you received Quel'Serrar, the High Blade. It was designed to be a tanking weapon, hence the warrior and paladin restriction on the tome. It had a fast speed, which was desired by warrior tanks due to the better rage generation, and it also had some stamina and a defensive dodge and armor proc. And as far as weapon models were concerned, at the time it was quite impressive. The hilt was golden and blue, and the blade had a silver finish with runes etched into it, and it also had this native green glow without an enchant. It was the tanking sword for quite a while, and to this day it remains a favorite of many classic warriors who completed the quest back in the day. An epic reward from just one of many epic quests. As I mentioned earlier, it was re-released in the Wrath of the Lich King expansion with the reskilled Onyxia's Lair, and there was also a quest to get its sister blade, Quel'Delar. You got this from a quest chain that started from the rare battered hilt drop, also in the expansion, but that's another story for later. Did someone say Thunderfury, the Blessed Blade of the Windseeker? Being one of the first legendaries released back in vanilla, is quite possibly one of the most iconic, if not the most iconic weapon in the entire game, even to this day. To get it back then, you needed 3 things: luck, 39 friends, and a lot of gold. Before we get into the actual weapon though, we should first talk about the history and lore behind it to get a good understanding of why it's epic. Or legendary, I guess. So I'll just give you a very abridged retelling here. Simply put, it's the weapon of the former prince of all wind elementals, Thunderon. A very long time ago, before the events of World of Warcraft, and before even the time of man, Azeroth was the stage of an all-out war between the 4 elemental lords: Ragnaros, the Fire Lord, Alakir, the Wind Lord, Neptulon, the Tide Hunter, and Therazane, the Stone Mother. Their itinerary was basically to keep Azeroth in a perpetual state of chaos and destruction. Why? Well, why not? Well, actually, it's because there was a 5th element, Spirit, that was being consumed by the world soul, Azeroth. This sent everything off balance, and as a result, the remaining elements became quite violent. It's sort of like Captain Planet, with Spirit as heart. So these elemental lords were at constant war with one another, and free to do as they please until the old gods arrived. Being far more powerful, they allied together in light of a common enemy, but it wasn't enough. They were defeated and were swiftly enslaved by the old gods and became tools to be used. The Pantheon would eventually arrive and defeat the old gods and put the elemental lords in timeout basically and imprison them in their own elemental planes. The Firelands for Ragnaros and all of the fire elementals, Deepholm for Therazane, Skywall for Alakir, and the Abyssal Maw for Neptulan. So no longer having that common enemy, they continued their war with one another, and a battle called the Elemental Sundering took place. This was a 5,000-year war between the two main belligerents, Ragnaros and Alakir, and Ragnaros wasn't playing fair. He had his two lieutenants, Baron Geddon and Gar, deceive and betray the prince of the air elementals, Thunderon. They lured him into a trap where he was struck down by Ragnaros and his weapon, Sulphurus, which is another weapon that we will cover. He consumed much of Thunderon's essence and became far more powerful, but he also saved some seconds for later. He stored what little remained of Thunderon's essence into two special artifacts, the left and right bindings of the Windseeker. These were placed in the hands of his trusted lieutenants, Gar and Geddon, where they would patrol the caverns of the Molten Core to protect Ragnaros during his slumber. So these two bindings, although it's just a small portion of his essence, hold incredible power, and they would be key in creating a weapon capable of harnessing it. Which brings us to the events of World of Warcraft. The first two raids in the game were Onyxia's Lair and the Molten Core, the dawn of raiding in World of Warcraft, essentially. That's right, no longer were you with 4 other people strolling through this small dungeon. You were 39 others working together to make it through this ultimate challenge at the time. In the original 2004 release, at this point in the game, even epic items were very rare. Most players had a full blue set from dungeons at most, so not just an epic, but rather a legendary was, well, legendary. They required a lot of luck and dedication, and only a small percentage of the player base would ever get them. And even to this day, 13 years later, it's still only held by a pretty small percentage of the player base, even though you can farm it much more efficiently. So, how did you get it? Well, of course, Baron Geddon and Gar were both bosses within the Molten Core, which held 10 total, ending with Ragnaros himself. There were different orders in which you could defeat them, but generally for most people, they were the 4th and 6th bosses in the raid that were killed, so they were fairly deep in it. Today in all of these classic re-releases, it's really not a problem, but back then they were quite difficult, and that's because people, for the most part, had no idea what they were doing, and it was chaos. But eventually, people started to get the hang of things, and they were able to take them down. They dropped several epic items as a reward, and a very, very small chance to drop a binding of the Windseeker, the artifact that Ragnaros had entrusted to them long ago. Baron Geddon dropped the left binding, and Gar dropped the right binding. The flavor text reads, the left and right halves of Thunderon's eternal prison. So one player needed to get both of these to be able to start the process of obtaining the sword. Another thing I should say here is that this was also back when people used dragon killing points, or DKP for short. With 40 people in one raid, it was chaos, and this point system was a way to try to have orderly ways of distributing them to all 40 of these players. You would essentially earn points by killing bosses and then spend them on items, and with Thunderfury being equipable by every class who could hold a sword, there was a lot of competition. If your guild was smart, they would limit preferably to warrior tanks, since they got the most benefit out of it, as the proc gives extra threat. But like I said, nobody knew what they were doing back then, so even hunters would get it in some cases. So you would raid Molten Core weekly, and hope and pray that the bindings drop, and also hope and pray that you have more DKP than everyone else. And if you manage to get them both, you went to the high-level Silithus zone and talked to an NPC called High Lord Demetrian. He asks you to examine a Vessel of Rebirth, which would later be used to summon Prince Thunderon once more, if you brought him some materials, that is. To do this, you needed 4 things: the left and right bindings, the essence of the Fire Lord, which is dropped by Ragnaros, and 10 legendary enchanted Elementium bars. So we have the bindings covered pretty thoroughly. As for the essence of the Fire Lord, this was quite hard to obtain at the time, with Ragnaros being the final boss. He was appropriately the hardest out of any of the encounters in the raid, and your guild needed to be on top of their game to take him down. You of course couldn't skip right to him. You had to kill all 9 other bosses and extinguish the runes near them before you could unlock the NPC to summon Ragnaros. But the bright side is that the essence was a 100% drop rate, so there was no luck involved there. Just skill. Remember earlier when I said that one of the 3 things that you needed was a lot of gold? Well, that's where these enchanted elementium bars came in. To make these, you needed 3 elemental flecks each, which you could buy from vendors at 3 gold each, so 30 total, which was 90 raw gold, and this was nothing to sneeze at back then. Today things get inflated like crazy because everybody knows the best mob farms, and there's so many mages AoEing everything, but back then most people were broke in vanilla, and gold was much harder to come by for most people, but we're just getting started. You also needed the rare fiery cores reagent, so 10 total for 10 bars. These dropped from the molten core, and in most cases if your guild was nice, they would usually supply you with these. Otherwise you would have to buy them off of the auction house. And you also needed 10 Arcanite bars for each enchanted bar, so that's 100 total. These were a high-end crafting reagent used in many endgame weapons and armor. They needed 1 thorium bar, which miners made, and another item called Arcanite crystal, which you rarely got from thorium veins. And to top it all off, only an alchemist could transmute the bars once per day, and they would usually charge a fee for that as well. And once more, you needed 100 of these things. And the last item you needed was something called an elementium ingot. These ended up being rare drops from the next raid, the Blackwing Lair, which was even harder than the molten core. You needed 1 for each bar, so that's another 10 total. And these 2 were very expensive and difficult to get. For most players, they would basically have to rely on their guild for supplying most of these materials because it was just too expensive for one person to handle. And if that wasn't enough, even smelting the bars was a challenge by itself. To learn the recipe, you had to find a special NPC in the Blackwing Lair named the Master Elemental Shaper Crixix, who is behind 4 bosses. You had to have one of your priests mind control him, and if you talked to him, he would teach you how to smelt the bars. After a lot of work and money, you had your bindings, you had your essence, and your enchanted elementium bars. Returning these to Demetrian allowed you to summon the fallen prince himself, Thunderon, so you of course would want to get your entire guild present, unless you're into getting one-shotted by elemental lords. You would have this climactic battle with the Windseeker, and if you were successful, he would leave behind his weapon, the orange dormant wind-kissed blade. Using it would start a quest called Rise Thunderfury, where you would force Demetrian to use the materials you provided to infuse the weapon with power, finally turning it into Thunderfury, the blessed blade of the Windseeker. It had a high DPS with a very fast 1.9 speed, agility, stamina, some resistances, and this proc I mentioned earlier that dealt damage and slows attack speed on targets hit. As I said, warrior tanks were the best recipients as it generated a lot of threat. It was so good, in fact, that they even used it for a while in the next expansion, the Burning Crusade. Although as a vanilla rogue, I didn't want to admit that back then. But regardless of all of that, it's become something of a meme within the game's community. You've probably seen it linked in trade chat. You do get a feat of strength if you manage to obtain it. It had its own card in the trading card game, and it was also re-released as an artifact model for Outlaw Rogues in the Legion expansion. Maybe this is Blizzard saying it was a rogue weapon after all. It was also part of the Shaman Order Hall questline, where you get Prince Thunderon as a follower. You picked up the blade from the corpse of a nameless adventurer. And you could even find it outside of the game in Diablo 3, Blizzard's action RPG game. And next up, we have actual hunter weapons. The bow, Rhok'delar, the staff, Lochdelar, and also a bonus quiver. These were rewarded after completing a very unique set of quests, which were all removed since the Cataclysm expansion. As we all know, everything is a hunter weapon, but these were actually hunter weapons. They're very iconic in the game's history. Just like with Thunderfury, they even got their own special cards in the official TCG. So let's start with the lore and history. It all started in the demon-infested forest, Felwood. Long ago, this was a normal, serene forest, much like its neighboring zone, Ashenvale. But during the Third War, it was corrupted and twisted by a dreadlord named Tychondrius, and turned into what it is today. He used a familiar artifact, the Skull of Gul'dan, to desecrate this once beautiful forest. It corrupted the trees, the wildlife, and lakes, and turned it into this putrid green color. Another casualty were the mighty ancients of Felwood. These are the giant tree ants that you rarely see in the game, and as powerful as they were, they too fell victim to Tichondrius' corruption, and they became petrified and turned into stone. The Third War eventually ended with the Legion's defeat, but many of these ancients were lost forever. But they did leave behind a special item, the Ancient Petrified Leaf. This was a quest starter, usable by hunters only, and it was the beginning of an epic set of trials to obtain very powerful weapons. Prior to the release of the Blackwing Lair raid, these were the hunter weapons to have. Not only were they powerful, but they were also sort of a status symbol for a while, because you didn't just have to kill a raid boss, but you also had to go through these trials and tests of skill that could only be completed solo. Although, as you'll see, there are some tricks that you could do to cheese it. But not even getting into the trials, just getting this leaf was pretty tough for a while. It dropped from the chest that spawns after the Major Domo Executus fight in the Molten Core raid. He was the second to last boss within the raid, so during that tier, killing him was no easy feat. It wasn't guaranteed to drop, and as you would imagine, only one hunter within the raid would be the lucky recipient. And upon use, it would start a quest to find the owner of the leaf, and that was it. No other information was given, so just imagine not using Wowhead or Thoughtbot at the time and scouring this giant world for the owner of the leaf. At this point in the game, there were no question mark icons on the map, so that itself would have been a monumental challenge had it not been for these handy database websites or word of mouth from other hunters who had already found the owner. And as it turns out, it's one of those spirits from those petrified ancients in the Felwood zone, only visible to hunters who held the leaf. As you would expect, they seek revenge against the Burning Legion, specifically against 4 agents hiding in 4 different corners of the world, and if you would agree to be their instruments of wrath, you would be rewarded with the weapons that, quote, the likes of which has not been seen for 10,000 years. Well, who could say no to that? So returning the leaf to them opened up 3 quests, the Stave of the Ancients, a proper string, and the Ancient Sinew-Wrapped Lamina. So going over them one by one, and saving the demon portion for last, the latter quest required you to bring back a mature blue dragon sinew, and as a reward you got an 18th slot epic quiver that gave you 15% ranged attack speed bonus. This was of course back when hunters used ammo for their weapons. Since this created some inventory problems, they also had quivers, typically of a larger capacity, so their bags weren't full all the time. These quivers and ammo pouches gave attack speed bonuses, sort of like an unequipped piece of gear, and this quiver I believe was the best at the time with an 18 slot capacity and a 15% attack speed boost. But to get the sinew you had a couple of options. It dropped from Azurgos at a 100% rate. This was an old world boss, now also removed from the game. If he wasn't alive, you could also farm appropriate level elite blue dragonkin enemies, and they could also drop it. Of course, at a much lower rate though. And if you didn't want to farm at all, you could also just buy it off of the auction house since it wasn't bound on pickup, but it would obviously fetch you a pretty penny. As for the next quest, a proper string, this required you to bring back an item called the Mature Black Dragon Sinew. This dropped off of the raid boss, Onyxia, at around a 30-ish% drop rate, which wasn't too bad. At this point, if you already got the leaf from Major Domo, your guild had Onyxia on farm most likely. Plus, a nice bonus was that you could even get the sinew even if you didn't have the quest, so a lot of the time you were ready to complete this as soon as you accepted it. And in similar fashion to the blue sinew, alternatively, you could also get this from appropriate level black drakes, although again at a much lower drop rate. But this awarded the Enchanted Black Dragon Sinew, which was a component needed to complete the bow and staff portion of the quest. This leads us to the most in-depth portion of the quest out of the 3, the Stave of the Ancients, which gave you the Ancient Runic Stave, which when combined with the Enchanted Sinew gave you the actual weapon. So to complete this part, you needed to track down 4 demons and kill them: Simone the Seductress in the Ungoro Crater, Clinfran the Crazed in the Burning Steppes, Solinar the Slayer in Silithus, and Artorias the Doombringer in Winterspring. And on top of that, you had to do it all solo. No help from any other player was allowed, because if someone jumped in, the demon would call you a coward and despawn before your very eyes. You couldn't even use your pet, so oh well, I guess, to all of the beast mastery hunters out there. But this means that items like target dummies and other special pet summoning trinkets were all a no-no. They were all disguised as neutral NPCs wandering about these zones, and you had to track each of them down and engage them solo. And they each provided their own unique challenge. Not having played a hunter back then, I'll briefly try to cover them as best I can. The Winterspring demon, Artorias, enraged periodically and casted a damage over time on you, so you had to kite him for the whole fight, like every boss, as you'll see. You could dispel his enrage with Tranquilizing Shot if you got that from the Molten Core, and he also took 350% more damage from Serpent Sting, so you always wanted that active on him as well. The next one, Simone, was a little tougher because she had a pet with her as well. She reduced your attack power and also casted a spell that did a high amount of damage to you, so kiting was seemingly out of the question here. But luckily, your Viper Sting had a bonus effect. It silenced her, which made her kiteable, so the strategy for her was to ice trap her pet, keep Viper Sting on her, and kite her when you can. Her melee damage was pretty weak, so meleeing her down was also an option as long as you kept her pet trapped. The next one was Clinfran in the Burning Steppes. This guy also had an enrage that made him deal high damage, but his weakness was that if he was afflicted by Scorpid Sting, he would only deal 1 damage in melee combat, so you wanted to keep that up as much as possible and kite him when you could. But the hardest one was Solinar in Silithus. He would cast a Fear on you, as well as homing beetles that hit very hard, and if he got in melee range, he would burn you down very quickly. And his weakness was tied to Wing Clip. Normally this just slowed enemies, but Solinar also gets immobilized for 30 seconds. For this fight, it was recommended that you bring some Shadow Absorb potions to help you, and you wanted to keep him rooted and do some tricky positioning along with some AoE for the beetles that he spawns. To make these fights easier, you could also get some buffs from allies before engaging. As long as they stay out of the fight, the demon won't despawn. But beyond that, the biggest trick that I recall was that you could actually just have another hunter kill them for you. As long as you were within range and didn't enter the demon's aggro table, you'd get credit for the kill, so there were some tricks if you were really having trouble with it. But if you were successful, you got the Ancient Rune Etch Stave, and like I said, you combine this with that Sinew to give you the bow, and initially, you could only have the bow or the staff, and you switched between them by using them. As you would imagine, most people went with the bow, unless you really wanted to be one of those rare melee hunters. But all of this was changed to where you just talk to the Ancient again to get both the bow and the staff, and equip them both at the same time. The bow had a pretty slow 2.9 speed with some ranged attack power and crit, and the staff was a nice stat stick with 2% crit, attack power against demons, nature resistance, and stamina and intellect. The models are quite interesting. They both have this very naturey elven look to it, although the staff kind of just looks like somebody tied 3 sticks together. A good side is that it's easy to cosplay. Just go in your backyard. And it also has this native green glow to it, which was neat. These are of epic quality, so you can, of course, transmog them if you did obtain them before their removal. 2 of my favorite items in the game because they were tied behind such an interesting challenge. And like I said, it was sort of a status symbol for a little while there. It was like, whoa, this guy knows what he's doing. Well, that's what I thought at least, but who knows, maybe all the people I saw just cheesed it. But if you didn't get them back then, there do exist some Rhok'delar knockoffs that you can still get. There's a reward from a druid quest that looks similar, and there's another one called Folly Spear from a quest in the Arathi Highlands. And to get the glow, you just transmog the Breath of Yulan enchant. And as for Rhok'delar, similar to Thunderfury, this was remade as an artifact appearance for marksman hunters in 4 different colors. A cool little callback for a cool classic weapon. And next, staying in vanilla, we have Sulfuras, the Hand of Ragnaros, which you guys may or may not recognize. We went over Thunderfury earlier. This is sort of the 2-handed brother found in the same raid, the Molten Core. I mentioned earlier that it's the legendary weapon of the Fire Lord and final boss of the raid, Ragnaros. and taking a description from the RPG, the weapon never leaves his grasp. It's composed of flaming red elementium and etched from end to end with intricate runes that seem to be flowing like lava across the weapon's surface. It's covered with many vicious pikes of varying sizes, each white hot and surrounded by the distortion of shimmering heat. When a creature is slain by sulfurous, its body is consumed by intense flame and effectively disintegrated, leaving behind only a pile of ash. The heat and pressure of this effect solidifies the ash into a hard and dark crystal. There's a war called the War of the Three Hammers between the Dark Iron Dwarves, the Bronzebeards, and the Wildhammer clan in battle over control of the city of Ironforge. The Dark Irons were driven out, and in an act of desperation, they summoned the Lord of the Firelands himself, Ragnaros, and now released from his prison, he used his mighty hammer of sulphurous to wreak havoc upon the lands, shattering the Red Ridge Mountains and leaving a giant volcano in his wake, later known as Black Rock Mountain, with the shattered mountains of Red Ridge now becoming the Searing Gorge and the Burning Steppes which border the actual mountain. Most of the Dark Irons were killed, and the survivors were enslaved by Ragnaros and his fire elementals, and they made their home in the Black Rock Depths. As for Ragnaros, it was his nap time, so he's been slumbering in the heart of the mountain at the hottest point located in the center of the Molten Core, saving up energy for a destructive campaign across Azeroth, which leads us to the events of World of Warcraft. So that's the backstory of the weapon and its wielder, but now how do you get it? Well, there are two components, the Sulfuron Hammer and the Eye of Sulphurous. Once again taking an excerpt from the RPG where it said enemies slain by sulphurous are turned into this crystal substance. It says that this crystal is known as an Eye of Sulphurous, and it's used by Ragnaros' followers in ancient rituals or to craft special weapons such as Sulfuron hammers. Sulphurous is incredibly massive, far too massive, in fact, for most mortals to ever dream of wielding, even if they could somehow defeat the elemental Fire Lord. But his followers found a way to craft hammers in its image at least, each requiring an Eye of Sulphurous, and these lesser weapons are known as Sulfuron hammers. Much like the original, it's the spiked, flaming red warhammer. It's crafted entirely from elementium, with an Eye of Sulphurous embedded deep into the hammer's head. So in the game, the Sulfuron hammer is this purple level 60 two-handed mace, crafted only by blacksmiths at a skill of 300, which was the cap for vanilla. It had a speed of 3.7, which was quite slow at the time, which was a good thing. You wanted slow weapons in your main hand back then. And it also had a chance to hurl a fireball at your target. As for the model, it's just this brown spiked mace with its latent powers yet to be unleashed. To get the recipe for it, you first had to obtain a rare crafting material called a Sulfuron Ingot, which was dropped by the Golem Egg boss located fairly deep within the Molten Core. He was usually the 7th boss that people killed, and once you got it, you would bring it to a special NPC located in the Black Rock Depths. He gave you a quest requiring the ingot, and in return he gave you the plans for the hammer. It's pretty simple, no reputation required, although the dungeon was a giant maze, so getting to him could be rough if you've never done it before. But looking at the materials, you had quite the smorgasbord here. To make it, you needed 8 more Sulfuron ingots, again, only obtainable from Golem Egg. You needed a whopping 50 Arcanite bars, which we went over earlier. To make these, you need to have 1 Thorium bar and 1 Arcane Crystal, only obtainable from high-level Thorium veins, and then give that to an alchemist who will transmute it into a bar on a daily cooldown. You also needed 10 each of Fiery and Lava Cores. These dropped from trash mobs throughout the Molten Core, and if your guild was nice, they would supply you with them. You also needed 25 Essences of Fire, which you could get from most high-level fire elementals within the game, and you also need 10 of something called Blood of the Mountain, which was a low drop chance from the Molten Destroyer giants found in the Molten Core, and also very rarely from Dark Iron ore veins, which you could sometimes find in the Searing Gorge and the Burning Steppes or the Black Rock Depths and the Molten Core. And lastly, you needed 20 Dark Iron bars. As you'd imagine, you make these by using Dark Iron ore, and it's 8 per bar, so 160 total. But you didn't have the recipe to smelt these bars by default, so how did you learn it? You had to make another stop at the Black Rock Depths and reach the room with the 7 dwarves. If your mining was high enough, they'll offer you a quest that teaches you the recipe, but in return you need to pay tribute with 2 star rubies, 10 true silver bars, and 20 gold bars. But that's not all. You can't smelt these bars at any old forge. No, you needed to smelt them at the Black Forge. This is an ancient forge used exclusively by the Dark Iron Dwarves, and once more can be found in the Black Rock Depths instance right outside the entrance to the Molten Core. It's guarded by dark iron, fire elementals, and is precariously in the middle of a river of lava. But the final step is the Eye of Sulphurous, and as simple as it was also the most difficult. It's a legendary item which, upon use, unleashes the powers hidden inside the Sulfuran Hammer to turn it into the legendary mace, Sulphurous. It dropped from Ragnaros only at a very low drop chance, around 1%, so quite difficult to get during that tier. But one of 40 lucky raid members would be the recipient, and once it was transformed, the hammer retained its slow 3.7 speed, it gained 12 strength, some stamina, and 30 fire resistance, which was actually pretty handy back then. Its fireball proc got beefed up, and you also got a thorns buff that would damage enemies who hit you because you were just so hot. The model was similar to the Sulfuran Hammer, except of course now with this bright orange glow, and it would definitely turn heads as it looked quite legendary to match its rarity. For a while there, this was the crown jewel two-hander that everyone wanted. It was mainly given to DPS warriors, retribution paladins, and enhancement shamans. A pretty popular vanilla shaman by the name of Unbreakable showed just how deadly it could be in an enhancement shaman's hands. And even compared to the next raid tier, it held its own pretty well. The big two-hander in Blackwing Lair was Ashkandi, which had more DPS, but its max damage was lower. And like I mentioned, people wanted high damage and slow speed for big hits. Ashkandi was a sword though, which gave it some benefit for warriors since sword spec got extra hits, and mace spec was just a stun at the time. As you would guess with other weapons, it got its own card in the TCG, and it ranks up there among the most iconic weapons within the game. It had the highest DPS until the Blackwing Lair, when that was released in patch 1.6, and it was the first obtainable one that I recall, not counting the Talisman of the Binding Shard, which was unintended. Thunderfury required Blackwing Lair content, but the Hand of Ragnaros was all Molten Core, so this was the original legendary, I think. It was also re-released in the Cataclysm expansion as a straight-up drop from Ragnaros in the Firelands, called the Extinguished Hand. The next one is for all of the priests out there, and that's Anathema and Benediction. Is similar in a lot of ways to Rhok'delar and Longsword, is tied behind an interesting quest chain that leads to a difficult event, and there's more than meets the eye, or eyes rather, so let's get into it. Similar to the hunter weapons, it all starts in the Molten Core raid, even from the same boss in fact, from the second to last boss in the raid, Major Domo Executus. There's a chance for a special item to drop. For priests, it's called the Eye of Divinity, a curious trinket with no stats, but with a flavor text. You can see movement when you peer into the eye, and if you click on it, you get the following text and clue for your next destination. When you peer into the eye, images of a great battle fill your mind. This terrifying conflict appears to be taking place somewhere in Lordaeron. You can barely make out a lone female figure standing amidst 1,000 corpses, fending off a sea of scourge. She is hopelessly outnumbered. Tendrils of light escape her hands, and cutting through the undead by the hundreds. All for naught, it would seem. Moments later, the priestess is swarmed by the corpses of the peasants that were surrounding her have risen. So, a lone priestess battling undead somewhere in Lordaeron. Again, very vague, just like the ancient petrified leaf, and had it not been for handy websites such as Thoughtbot or word of mouth, finding exactly where you were supposed to go was a challenge, to say the least. But a good place to start looking is the Eastern Plaguelands, a high-level zone in Lordaeron that's infested with undead, and if you were thorough enough in your search, you would find an NPC named Eris Havenfire in the very northwestern part of the zone near Stratholme. She's only visible to priests who have the Eye of Divinity equipped. She offers you a quest called the Balance of Light and Shadow, the goal of which is to save 50 peasants before 15 are slain, and accepting it starts a gauntlet of sorts, and similar to the Hunter quest, if anyone entered the area, everything would despawn and you would fail it. This one was much more harsh though, because another person just needed to be within the immediate area, and a demon called the Cleaner would spawn and wipe out everyone, and Eris would despawn for 2 hours. So if someone wanted to mess up your day, it was very easy, or if they just wanted to try to help and they didn't know. It was a very fragile event, so if you were to start it, you better be prepared. The quest involves a combination of both damage and healing, so having a talent specialization of both Holy and Discipline was the common strategy, and when you started it, a group of friendly peasants would spawn in front of the cave, and your goal was to get them safely to a beacon of light. And you do this by healing them and killing attacking enemies and by abolishing diseases. There are 2 ranks of disease, purple and green. The purple deals much more damage than the green, so you had to dispel those immediately if you saw them active. And another danger are enemy spawns that attack both you and the peasants, so these of course had to be killed as well, and even items like Stratholme Holy Water were very useful here. Pretty much anything to help with undead enemies. Also on the route to the beacon are untargetable skeletal archers that just deal constant damage to the peasants. So you had to cleanse diseases, kill undead, heal peasants until you got 50 across without letting 15 or more die. It was pretty challenging during the Molten Core tier, and consumables and buffs from other players were very helpful as long as they weren't in the immediate area, of course. If you were successful, you would be awarded with a special item called the Splinter of Nordrissel, which reads, a tiny fragment of the world tree. Just to throw in a little lore here, Nordrissel is the original world tree which you found atop the Mount Hyjal zone. It had great healing powers and it gave Night Elves their immortality, but during the Third War, to stop Archimonde, Malfurion Stormrage sacrificed the tree's power. It was heavily damaged and a new tree called Teldrissel was grown to replace it, and unless someone lights it on fire, we should be good to go. Oh, wait a second. So even just a splinter of Nordrissel holds incredible power. Now we just need to bring it out. You have to use it in combination with 2 items, the Eye of Divinity, which we already have, and another one called the Eye of Shadow. And for this you had a few options. It dropped off of the world boss, Lord Kha'Zix, at a 40% rate. He spawned in the Blasted Land zone, and being a world boss, of course, there's a lot of competition to take him down, so your guild would have to be on the lookout for him and go kill him as soon as he spawned. Another option was to just farm it at a much lower rate off of elite demons in Winter, Spring, or Blasted Lands. They held around a 1% chance to drop the eye, so this too was also an option, although it usually required a small group to farm them efficiently. And your last option was to just buy it off the auction house. It wasn't bound, so this was always a choice if you had the gold. And in fact, just farming eyes was a pretty good way to make gold back then, if I recall correctly. But regardless of your methods, getting all 3 of these items together allowed you to make the Benediction and Anathema staff, and just like the initial release of Rhok'delar and Loch'delar, using it would switch between the 2. Benediction was aimed for healing priests, either holy or discipline, and Anathema was for shadow priests. Light and shadow, just like the quest. Anathema has this dark and native green glow, and Benediction this bright yellow. They definitely stood out from other staves in the game. I think we need to get Kralnor's opinion on that one though. Next up, we have the legendary Warglaives of Azzinoth from the Burning Crusade expansion. These were the first legendaries of the expansion, not counting the temporary ones that you get from the Kil'Thas fight, and they were unique in the sense that they were part of an actual set, and it's believed by many to have the most impressive looking models in the entire game. But before we get into the actual weapons, as usual, let's talk about their history and that of their wielders. The original wielder was not Illidan Stormrage, but rather a demon named, Azzinoth. The story behind him is that he was a powerful lieutenant in the War of the Ancients. This was the Burning Legion's first invasion upon Azeroth, which Illidan, among many others, were a belligerent of. We don't really know too much about Azzinoth's confrontation with Illidan, other than he was slain by him, and that Illidan absorbed his power because in the Gul'dan fight in the Nighthold in Mythic mode, some adds called Soul Fragments of Azzinoth will spawn, and here you can see what he actually looked like. Oddly enough though, his official art depicts him as a Terror Guard rather than a Doom Guard, so there's a little discrepancy there, but just wanted to clear up that he was the original wielder of the glaives. Like I said, they are of course part of a set, 2 one-handers classified as swords, and in the lore you're able to combine them into one weapon, sort of like a giant shuriken, although as far as I know we've never actually seen that happen. So Azzinoth was slain, and his glaives were taken by Illidan Stormrage, and this character I'm sure many of you know of. Just a huge amount of lore tied behind him, but for the sake of keeping this video more about the glaives rather than Illidan, I'll give you a very, very abridged telling of his story. So Illidan, as we know him in-game, is the final boss of the Black Temple raid, one of the big bads of the Burning Crusade expansion. He's the Lord of the Outland and Master Detector of Duplicity. He's the first Demon Hunter and brother of Malfurion Stormrage. He was originally a sorcerer, and in Legion you learned some more backstory with him and how his hatred of the Burning Legion and his thirst for power sort of blinded him and turned him into this ruthless killing machine. Not necessarily a bad guy, but also not a good guy. More of an anti-hero, some would say. So he fought alongside his brother Malfurion and other allies during the War of the Ancients. He eventually defected to the Burning Legion though, in an attempt to destroy them from within, and it was because of this that he gained the title the Betrayer, where he was imprisoned below Mount Hyjal and watched over by Maiev Shadowsong for 10,000 years. Azeroth eventually prevailed in the War of the Ancients, and then, after 10,000 years in prison, he was freed by his friend Tyrande Whisperwind to aid Azeroth in the Third War, which was the Legion's second invasion upon Azeroth. He came to battle the Dreadlord Tychondrius, and in doing so, he absorbed the fell energies held within the powerful Skull of Gul'dan artifact. He gained great powers and defeated the Dreadlord, but at a great cost. He turned into a demon, and his appearance changed to the form that we all recognize today. He sacrificed everything to protect his home and his allies, but at the end he was banished by his brother Malfurion for once again taking it too far. He eventually fled to the Outland, where he overthrew its ruler, Megtheridon. He allied with the former prince of Quel'Thalas, Kil'Thas Sunstrider, and started amassing forces to destroy the Burning Legion once and for all. So in-game, we see him as the final boss of the Black Temple raid in the Burning Crusade expansion, and to get to him, you have to go through several extremely challenging fights, and to even zone into the Black Temple, you initially had to go through this extremely lengthy attuning process requiring many other raids. It wasn't the final raid of the Burning Crusade, that was Sunwell, but it certainly was one of the hardest. Illidan sits atop the temple, peering into the Skull of Gul'dan, the artifact that made him into what he is today, and with the Warglaives in hand, he battles it out with 25 adventurers in a 4-phase fight. In the middle of it, he takes to the sky, throws his glaives to the ground, and summons some flame elementals of Azzinoth, and he of course just fights you straight up with his iconic Warglaives. But with the help of his former jailer, Maiev, you take him down, and if you're lucky, he'll drop either the left or the right Warglaive of Azzinoth. So you have the main hand and the offhand. The set bonus has a chance to give you some haste for 10 seconds on attacks, and appropriately a passive to increase attack power when fighting demons. The models are quite stunning even to this day. Definitely the most flashy weapon at the time. just huge models and this bright green fell glow. During vanilla World of Warcraft, there were a few NPCs in the game that used glaives. You could find them in Dire Maul, the guards in Darnassus also had them, and I remember everyone always wanted them. Ever since episode 1, just the idea of having a double-bladed weapon was just insanely cool, and these Warglaives just took that to the extreme. In fact, if you watched my most famous and infamous player series, someone wanted them so badly that they offered to buy another player's account which had the glaives for nearly 7,000 euro, or 10,000 US dollars at the time. The trade was made, and shortly after, the account was banned for account sharing. Those are some expensive pixels. Just like many others in this video, it had its own card in the official trading card game. 3 of them actually. The left, the right, and also the set. A legendary appearance to match its legendary rarity, dropped from a legendary character in a legendary expansion. As legendaries as these weapons are, they don't need to be orange to have an interesting story behind them or to be heavily coveted. So next up, we're going to give credit to some of the unsung heroes of the game, namely in vanilla. The first of which, kind of similarly to the Warglaives of Azzinoth, being an actual set, and as a vanilla rogue, I have to talk about the Dal'Rand sword set. Before raiding, this was rogues and warriors' wet dream. I believe hunters also wanted it for the stats, but then again, hunters want everything. They're pretty unique because they were a weapon set, which was kind of weird at the time. Armor sets were common, but weapons? You didn't see that too often. There is some lore and references tied behind them. Dal'Rand is the full name of Rend Blackhand, who is the son of the former war chief of the Horde, Blackhand the Destroyer. He's been hanging out in Blackrock Mountain along with his clan, hoping to overthrow Thrall for the title of war chief based on his lineage. Sort of like a Game of Thrones mindset, but without the incest. Well, as far as I know anyways. So he's allied himself with Nefarian and the Dark Horde, which is what the inhabitants of the Blackrock Spire call themselves, and he's been biding his time and waiting for a moment to strike. The Blackrock Spire was the first raid in vanilla. It was just a 15-man, but still a raid, and it was filled with some pretty tough fights. Rend Blackhand himself takes on the adventurers in this gauntlet type of fight where you're assaulted by waves of chromatic dragonkin. If you survive the initial onslaught, you fight Rend and his giant drake named Gith. At the time, there was this rumor going around that he would drop his mount, but that only came true a few expansions later with the Experiment 12B mount from Dragon Soul, which is a reference to Gith. And the other parts of the names, the Sacred Charge and the Tribal Guardian, is a reference to Blizzard's action RPG, Diablo 2 with the sword set, Volcathos' Sacred Charge and Tribal Guardian. The main hand had a slow 2.8 speed, which is what you wanted back then for big hits. It also had 1% critical strike and some strength. And as for the offhand, it was a pretty fast 1.8 speed with some defensive stats on it. So at first glance, you would think that this maybe is for a tank, but the problem is that it's offhand only, so you couldn't use a shield with it, which was unfeasible back in the original launch. But of course, with the re-releases, people realized how powerful Fury Warrior tanks are. So in today's climate, it's actually really good before you step into raiding for Fury Warrior tanks. But yeah, anyways, the itemization was all over the place back in the day, and it was up to the players to decide who got the most benefit from which item. Except hunters, they've shown themselves irresponsible with that. As for the set bonus, it was 50 attack power, which was pretty huge back then. For rogues, that would be 50 points worth of agility, minus the crits, so nothing to sneeze at. And believe it or not, the look was quite impressive back then. When most weapons looked like this, getting something that looked like this was a pretty big deal. The model was reused for Viscadge the Bloodletter that dropped from the Onyx's Lair raid, which was another great one-hander for rogues and Fury Warriors. The drop rates for Dal'Rands, as I remember, were pretty low. Even though they were just blues, I believe they had just around a 5% drop chance for each one. And even more rarely, you could get the Fell Striker. This was originally called the Death Striker before a name change, but what made this one special was, as you could see, while it didn't have any stats, it had this interesting proc. For every hit, you have a chance that all attacks are guaranteed to land and to be critical strikes for 3 seconds. This was insane. because even landing hits back then was tough if you didn't have enough of the hit stat, and even still, level 63s and bosses were also harder to hit due to how weapon skills worked. But basically everybody wanted this. Aside from the fact that it was shiny purple, combat rogues wanted it for offhand, assassination rogues of course, fury warriors, and yes, even hunters. Hunters just wanted everything. The proc rate was roughly 4%, and it wasn't unique, meaning that if you were the luckiest person ever, you could equip 2 of them. But one of the most interesting daggers in the game, and if you ran into a rogue with them in PvP, you were in for a painful time. And it even got its own card in the trading card game, which was pretty neat. Yeah, see that? Rogue and warrior. Don't even try it, hunters. Since we're talking about Rend, we may as well just empty the barrel here. Another interesting item dropped not from him, but rather his drake, called the Chromatic Carapace, which wasn't an armor nor a weapon, but instead a quest item. Right nearby from Rend's room, you can find an injured whelp named Abi, who's related to the Carapace. The Chromatic Dragonflight, whom you just got done fighting, are the result of unnatural experimentation by Nefarian, with Chromagus in the Blackwing Lair raid being one of his biggest abominations. They're created by using the blood of dragons from different dragonflights, and Abi happens to be one of the many blue dragonflight that were captured by Nefarian. It asks you to travel to Winterspring to use its skill to teleport to the matron of the blue dragonflight, Hala. She would send you on a series of quests that would eventually award you with some epic armor of your choice, either the breastplate or the leg plates of Chromatic Flight. To complete these, you needed the Chromatic Carapace for one, which dropped from Gith at around a 2% drop rate, and you also need 10 brilliant chromatic scales, which dropped from and were skinned from the Chromatic Dragonflight you just fought, and also off of Chromagus in the Blackwing Lair. And you also needed something called Blood of Heroes, Skins of Shadow, and Frayed Abomination Stitchings, depending on what armor piece that you're going for. You got the Blood of Heroes from the Eastern Plaguelands. These were spread throughout the zone on the ground. Some of you might remember when you picked them up, you would get ambushed by elite NPCs that slow you. This claimed many lives back in the day. As for the Skins of Shadow, they dropped from the Scholomance dungeon at a pretty low rate, and the stitchings you got from the Strathholm dungeon from the Abominations at the end. The breastplate was a plate chest that gave quite a lot of stamina, strength, agility, and fire resistance, and it was pretty good for quite a while, especially for fire resist fights like Ragnaros. If you opted for the male legs instead, you had a choice between intellect or agility, with resistances to each school of magic. One is aimed towards hunters and enhancement shamans, and the other for elemental and restoration. This quest ended up getting removed, along with many other things in the Cataclysm expansion, but it's remembered as a cool little addition to the Blackrock Spire raid. I actually happened to get the Carapace on my paladin way back in the day. I was the last of several people to roll. One guy rolled a 99. This was back when they showed the rolls as people clicked the button, and then I miraculously rolled a 100. But sadly I never finished it, so it was a big waste, so sorry random guy from 20 years ago. And since we're still on Rend, I have one more for you, and that's the Blackhand Doomsaw. There's not really a huge story tied behind this, but I thought it was worth mentioning still, mainly because of the luck. This was the trusty weapon of Rend Blackhand, and he had a chance to drop it. And as far as weapon models went, it was quite unique at the time, and someone noted that it looked similar to the Warcraft 3 Blade Master's weapons. It had a fairly slow speed and a damage proc, which made it a good starter weapon for fresh 60s, and I remember you'd see a ton of paladins and warriors wielding it. It was sort of like the pre-Arcanite Reaper, and people would jokingly call it the Blackhand Noob Saw since it was so prolific. Definitely one of the staples for vanilla two-handers, and it was also even used by the great Leroy Jenkins, so that must mean it's amazing, right? As it turns out, all of these weapons are no longer available thanks to the Warlords of Draenor revamp of the Blackrock Spire, and Cataclysm in the case of the Chromatic Carapace questline. But the Doomsaw was actually preserved as a re-release called the Blackhand Doomcutter, which dropped from the new revamped dungeon. And there's another one called Lentrezor's Warblade from a quest in the Burning Crusade. And as for the Dalren set, this was also acknowledged as an heirloom, so these weapons made their mark in the game for sure. Weapons are great and all, but armor can be just as iconic and interesting. So next up, we have the tier 0.5 set. In vanilla World of Warcraft, before raiding, you had the tier 0 dungeon sets. This was the blue armor for each class, and the pieces were scattered across many different dungeons in the game. For druids, it was Wildheart. The hunters had Beast Stalker, Mage, the Magister set, Paladins Lightforge. The priest set was called Devout. Rogues had Shadowcraft. The shaman had the Elements, and Warlock, the Dreadmist, and Warriors, the Valor sets. At first, it was pretty rare to see the full set, and it was almost a status symbol. Before everybody started raiding, even blue items were pretty impressive, so it was like, whoa, this guy knows his stuff. And combining that with the looks and set bonuses, it made him quite special. They'd all, of course, be replaced with the superior tier 1 set found in the Molten Core raid, and then after that, tier 2 and so on. But lost within the shuffle was something called the tier 0.5 set, or Dungeon Set 2 as it's called. This was sneaked in patch 1.10 pretty late in Vanilla's lifespan in March of 2006, and at this point the Temple of Ahn'Qiraj was already in the game, and that held tier 2.5, so raiders really had no interest in this revamped dungeon set. It was more aimed towards those who were stuck in 5-mans as their endgame, of which there were plenty because raiding back then was so time consuming. These sets were slightly modified and better versions of their originals. The Wildheart upgraded to Feral Heart, Beast Stalker to Beast Master, Magisters to Sorcerers, Lightforge to Soulforge, Devout to Virtuous, Shadowcraft to Dark Mantle, Elements to Five Thunders, Dreadmist to Deathmist, and Valor to Heroism. And in looks, they were just different color palettes for the most part, but in both stats and rarity, they were far superior to their blue counterparts. The quest chain that awarded them was the same for each class, but it was extremely long and expensive. So as a result, very few people completed it, and in fact, if you even mention these tier 0.5 sets to people today, a lot of them will have no clue what you're talking about. Well, that all changes right now. The whole idea of this quest chain is to collect 3 fragments of an amulet to break an ancient curse. This will mainly be from an alliance perspective, but the chain is pretty much mirrored for the Horde. I'll list any minor differences in text, but other than that, the main differences are just the turn-in NPCs. For the alliance, it all started from the NPC Deliana, located just outside the throne room in Ironforge, and Makvar the treasurer for Horde, who you could find in Thrall's throne room in Orgrimmar. They tell you that they have in their possession a powerful set of armor worn by your class, and they're willing to give it to you for a favor. So because this chain upgrades your tier 0 to 0.5, you of course already had to own all of your original tier 0 set, which consisted of 8 pieces: bracers, belt, boots, gloves, pants, shoulders, chest, and head. And going with the alliance chain, the first step is to upgrade the bracers. Deliana sends you to the Winter Spring Zone, located all the way on the other continent. Remember, this is vanilla, and the traveling for these quests was legendary itself, and it was all on ground. Here you needed to get 15 blood samples from the wildlife, and if you brought the blood back and gave her 20 gold and your bracers, you get the upgraded pair for the Dungeon Set 2, and just 7 more to go. At this point, with the 20 gold requirement, I do want to emphasize just how expensive it was to finish the chain, and it's the main reason why a lot of people skipped it. This is just the beginning, and if you take into account that you're losing your original enchants, this chain was pretty pricey to finish. But with this, part 1 is done, and we have the bracers. For the next part, you need to talk to a dead person's ghost, and to do that, you need to visit a master engineer that specializes in the supernatural. You're sent to Muck's Mana Scrambler in Gadgetzan, and being a goblin, he of course wants money out of you. To progress to the next part, you need to give him 40 gold, which at this point was, again, quite a lot. Most people had like 100 in their pockets. Everyone was broke, but that wasn't all. You also needed a bunch of trade materials, and this is where most people said, screw this is out of my price range, and they just stuck with their old set. But you needed a delicate Arcanite converter, which was made by engineers, 4 greater eternal essences, which enchanters got from disenchanting high-level green items, 10 stone skill oil, which were made by alchemists, and 25 volcanic ash, which you had to get yourself. You got these from the Burning Steps zone on the ground, typically near lava pools. So this part didn't cost anything, but it was a lot of travel, and 25 made it pretty time consuming. But speaking of travel, we're just getting started. Mux builds you the ghost trap, and for the next part, you needed to use it to collect ectoplasm from all across the world. 12 scorched from enemies in Silithus, 12 frozen from enemies in Winterspring, and 12 stables from enemies in the Eastern Plaguelands. Did I say that traveling in vanilla was ridiculous yet? And to also use this trap, you needed something called Goblin Rocket Fuel, which you're given 8 to start off, but if you used all of them before you collect all 36 essences, you had to buy more from an engineer. So you brought all of this goo and the trap back to Mux in Tanarus, and he sent you back to the Burning Steppes to get the magma core from an earth elemental located inside the zone. Hey, why didn't you tell me to do this while I was getting the ash here earlier? What an ash hole. You return the core, and you need just one more part. It's a fell elemental rod, but the only problem is that you have to buy this from an imp merchant named Viel, who's located in an elite-infested area in southern Winterspring. Luckily though, he isn't super deep into that area, and he's just in the first cave that you see on the right side. The rod, however, costs 40 gold, so again, pretty pricey. You returned it to Mux, he finishes the device, and tells you to return it to Deliana in Ironforge if you're Alliance, or Makvar in Orgrimmar if you're Horde. And as a reward for getting this far, for the next quest, you're asked to turn in your belt and gloves for an upgrade. And as a bonus, the gloves actually upgrade in rarity, so you get your first purple piece of the set here. But we're not satisfied with just 3 pieces. You ask for the next task, and you're sent to the entrance of the Stratholme dungeon along with the ghost device, and you're told to use it near the entrance, and doing so will reveal the ghost of Anthean Harmon. From him, you need to obtain some information about a special amulet. He agrees to help you, but in return you have to do him a favor. You need to go inside the Stratholme dungeon and rescue someone called Ysida Harmon from the final boss of the undead side, the Baron Rivendare. So this is our first official group quest in the chain. There's just one catch though. When you enter the dungeon, a 45-minute timer starts, and this NPC is slain at the end of it, so not only did you need to clear through it, but you also had to do it pretty quickly. So quick, but careful clearing until you reach the final boss. And if you were successful, Ysida gave you her locket, which you returned to Anthean. You ask him information about a Draconid named Valthalak and a special medallion that he held, and he tells you that it has Valthalik's soul stored inside of it, and that he took it and divided it amongst his friends. But upon doing so, they unleashed a curse upon themselves that's still active, even in death. And he goes on to say that he gave the first piece to a dwarf named Theldrin, who's a gladiator for the Dark Iron Dwarves. So you need to fight him to get the medallion back. But to do so, you need a bunch of materials. 3 Dark Iron bars, which are made by miners, 20 enchanted leathers from enchanters, 3 mooncloth from tailors, and 4 cured rugged hides from leatherworkers. All pretty pricey trade goods, so the investment was really starting to pile up at this point. So what did you need all this stuff for? A banner, of course. Hey, you can't just ask to fight the guy. You need this special banner, and it's not even finished yet. You need to take it to an NPC named Falrin Treeshaper, located in the library in the Diremaul dungeon. So again, a group is needed to clear through to this NPC, and to follow along with the scheme of things before he helps you, you need to do him a favor. He asks you to kill ogres inside of the dungeon and to bring their war beads as proof, 25 of them in total. But at least you get an amulet as a reward, which was a nice little bonus. Falrin will then enchant the banner to provoke Theldrin, but to do that he needs some materials. 4 dark runes, which are drops from enemies in the Skullman's dungeon. So you either got a group or you bought them off the auction house since they weren't soulbound. And you also needed 8 large brilliant shards, which enchanters got from disenchanting high-level blue items, and a quest item called Jeering Spectre Essence, which dropped from ghosts located in the Diremaul dungeon once more. This is a pretty elaborate way of challenging someone to a fight, don't you think? But anyways, you take the special banner to the arena located inside the Blackrock Depths instance to summon the secret Theldrin boss and his posse, and your goal is to take him down. He dropped some loot, some of which is unique in transmog, so to this day people are looking for others with the banner to get some rare transmogs, and he also dropped the first fragment of the amulet. Returning it to Anthean, he tells you that you need 2 more fragments. But as a bonus, you get to turn in 3 more pieces, the boots, which were purple, and also the pants and shoulders. Just 2 more to go, which is the head and the chest. You're told to track down Bodley, who is last seen entering the Blackrock Spire in the Blackrock Mountain. So you bring the Ghost Revealer with you, and you use it to speak with his ghost, and it gives you the last 2 parts, the head and the chest, and that's quest complete. No, just kidding. You need to travel to the other side of the world to get an item called the Cinder of Cinders. This dropped from an NPC named the Duke of Cinders in the Silithus Zone, but he's not just a normal NPC. You have to do this little ritual to summon him. You need to kill Twilight cultists within the zone until you obtain 3 pieces of their armor as a disguise, a cowl, a mantle, and a robe. Having all 3 gives you access to something called a Windstone, which allows you to summon the Lord of Cinders. But to do that, you first needed a medallion called the Twilight Cultist Medallion of Station, and to get this, you needed to complete a quest chain. And to start this chain, you needed to do some farming to reach the friendly reputation with the Cenarian Circle. Not getting into the actual rep farming, once you do that, you talk to an NPC named Oral Goldleaf in the Cenarian Hold in Silithus. You needed to bring her 1 large brilliant shard and 3 items called Abyssal Crests. You got the latter by equipping that Twilight set you got earlier and clicking on lesser Windstones located throughout the zone to summon an elemental, which dropped them. Turning in the materials gave you the medallion, which gave you a 1 in 4 chance upon clicking the normal Windstones of summoning the Duke of Cinders. So you kill him, get the Cinder, bring it back to... Wait, what were we doing again? Oh yeah, Bodley needed this. But he also needed 2 more items called the Incendicite of Incendius, which dropped from Lord Incendius, a boss in the Blackrock Depths, and he also needed the Ember of Emberseer, which was from the Pyroguard Emberseer in the Upper Blackrock Spire raid, which only opened with the Seal of Ascension, which was a reward of another lengthy quest chain, or alternatively someone else in your party could get it. And you also need an item called the Hallowed Brazier, which you could buy from the Argent Dawn faction for 120 gold at Honored Reputation or higher. Oh my god. No wonder like 1% of the population finished this chain. It's kind of insane. I'm worn out just talking about it. So, you bring all of this stuff back to Bodley, and he'll give you 1 of 4 quests selected at random. It'll be called the Components of Importance, and the possibilities are either retrieve a brilliant Sword of Zealotry, which is looted from Elite Scarlet Praetorians located in the Elite Tier's Hand Zone in the Eastern Plaguelands, and another possibility would be to retrieve Soul Ashes of the Banished, which you got from Undead located on Purgation Isle, which could be found off the coast of the Hillsbrad Foothill Zone. Option number 3 were the druidical remains from the Silithid, located at Hive Regal in southeast Silithus, and number 4 was to track down the Starbreeze Village relic, which you could find back at the Frost Whisper Gorge in southern Winterspring from the Frostmaw Giants. All 4 of these quests involved killing elite enemies, which were soloable with the right class and gear, but still tough. But whichever one you got, you brought it back to Bodley, and he gave you a follow-up quest. If you got the Blade of Zealotry, your next goal is to take the brazier you put together earlier in the final boss room of the human side of Stratholme to summon 2 undead enemies named Jarian and Sathos, and you kill them and loot the left piece of the amulet. In the previous part, if you got the Soul Ashes, you then head to the Skullman's dungeon into Ras Frost Whisper's room, which was near the end of the instance, and you use this brazier to summon an ogre named Cormac. If you got the Druidical Remains quest, the follow-up for that was to head to Warmaster Voon's room in the Lower Blackrock Spire to summon a Tauren druid named Mor Greyhoof. And lastly, if you got the relic, you needed to go to the Satyr, Alzin the Wild Shaper's room all the way in Darmal East. You kill him, and using your brazier, you summon the Night Elf Isalian. So, obviously all 4 of these required a full group to summon and kill, and just like Theldrin in the Blackrock Depths, they all dropped loot, and some are still sought after as transmogs to this day. Players who actually completed this whole chain and kept these items can still summon a few of them, but since it was so long, hard, and expensive, these people are extremely rare to find. But anyways, whichever scenario you got, you turned into Bodley, and that's 2 of 3 fragments. And for the next part, he asks you to gather some reagents to cast a spell. It happens to be 20 blood kelp from Naga, located on the Alkaz Island in the Dustwallow Marsh Zone. This was one of the zones in vanilla that really wasn't finished. There were very few quests here, so through this chain and the Onyxia attunement, they found a way to do something with it. But these Naga were all high levels, so they were pretty difficult, but soloable with the right class and gear again. And the next 2 parts are basically just repeats from the previous. You know the part of the chain where there were 4 possibilities? Out of those remaining 3 scenarios, you'll get 1 randomly for the next 2 parts. So the Sword from Tyr's Hand, the Ashes from Purgation Isle, and the Druidical Remains from Silithus, or Relic from Winterspring. After that, you get one of those 4 quests to go into those dungeons to summon another boss, and doing so gave you the final piece of the amulet. And as for the last part, it required you to go into a raid, the Upper Blackrock Spire, and kill elite orcs there until you get 40 Blackrock Bracers. And just in case you thought you were home free in terms of gold, you also needed a Flask of Supreme Power, which was the spell power flask for vanilla, which was made by alchemists and was also pretty expensive. But regardless, you brought it back to Bodley, and the next part was the finale. You go back once more to the Upper Blackrock Spire to summon Lord Valthalak himself. As I mentioned, this guy was an elite Draconid, and you summoned him in the Beast's Room, so once again near the end of the raid. And it was actually a pretty tough fight, involving 3 phases total where he drains life, summons adds, and enrages and throws out Shadow Bolt volleys. Definitely a worthy final boss to quite an insane quest chain. If you were successful though, you use the completed amulet on his corpse to summon his spirit, and he agrees to end the curse now that the amulet is returned. So you return to Bodley, and he tells you to go back to Deliana for the Alliance or Makvar for the Horde, and they thank you by letting you trade in your Tier 0 chest and helmet for their Tier 0.5 counterparts. He or she wishes you luck in hopes that this armor will protect you for a long time, or until the next expansion, I guess. Which isn't super useful because it will probably take a year for most people to complete this quest chain. But regardless, that's pretty much it. You're a little older, a little more broke, but you have a cool new set. Maybe it didn't have better stats than the raiding sets, but it was definitely more rare and, in its own way, more difficult to get. Like, what do you want to do? Go on this insanely long and expensive quest chain, or just raid the Molten Core? It was the ultimate prize for the non-raiding player for sure. Today, of course, thanks to the Cataclysm expansion, the chain and thus the armor sets are now removed from the game. You can still obtain both Tier 0 and 0.5 as transmogs from the Darkmoon Fair if you'd like, but they just exist for looks and they don't have any stats or anything. But another bonus is that from completing this chain, you got to keep the tools to summon any of these bosses anytime you want, in case you wanted some of their unique loot. So Cormac from Skullments, Jerian Sathos from Stratholme, Saline from Daramal, and more Greyhoof from the Lower Blackrock Spire, and Valthalak from the Upper Blackrock Spire. Today, due to the many dungeon re-releases, there's not a lot you can actually summon still. I think only Asalian, more Greyhoof, and Theldrin survived the revamps, and the rest are lost forever, unless you're playing Classic, of course. So taking a break from crazy quest chains and talking about something a little more simple. Next up we have Teebu's Blazing Longsword. This was actually a world drop. It dropped from trash mobs in high-level dungeons and raids, and originally it was the Holy Grail item in the game. It was on the original box art, and therefore the first epic that most people saw. Just looking at this picture is an experience itself. The zoomable minimap makes navigation simple. What a story, Mark! Enter the world with one-click access to Blizzard's dedicated World of Warcraft game network. I'm pretty sure it was more than one click. Here, let's test it. Yeah, see? At least 2 clicks. And that's counting if you created a character already. Damn false advertising. But if you get to hurl your fiery balls at people, then sign me up. The actual in-game sword is a little different. It has slightly less DPS, and you have an actual number for the fiery ball proc. 150 damage. So this was probably one of the rarest items in the game. I think I saw one in my whole time playing in vanilla, and it was on a hunter. Go figure. It looks like a lightsaber, so it has this nice aesthetic to it, and it's even a light source. If you bring it in dark areas, you'll see that it lights up the area, which is a cool subtle detail, I think. Unfortunately, its rarity was diminished in the Warlords of Draenor expansion because you could get it from one of the buildings there. But still, it's one of the holy grails in the classic game. The next one I wanted to mention was Sulthraze the Lasher. This one I always thought was cool because it's not a drop, rather it's a combination of 2 other drops. It's tied to the Zul'Farrak instance all the way back in Tanarus, which is a level 45 dungeon. In here you can get a couple of blue one-hander swords, Sangthraze the Deflector off of the Antusol boss, who is the Basilisk Keeper, and Jangthraze the Protector from Chief Ukor's Sand Scalp, who is like the final boss of the dungeon. Alone, these are pretty ordinary one-handers, one for tanks and another for DPS, but if you got both on one character and combined them, you formed the epic Sul'Thraze sword. The model looked quite nice at the time, especially for its level, and it had an interesting proc which lowered strength and dealt some shadow damage, both instantly and over time. Back in vanilla, there were a bunch of items that had weird procs like this, life drains and stat reduction. Kind of interesting. The speed was 2.6, which was really fast, which made it pretty bad actually since you wanted slow weapons back then. I think the real value was just in the novelty of having the purple and the cool way of obtaining it. It's still obtainable today, so if you want to unearth a nifty relic of the past and get yourself a transmog, head on over to Zul'Farrak. Next up, we have Ironfoe. This was a legendary hammer forged by the Master Smith, Frank Lorne Forgewright. Hey, if you have Forge in your name, you know you're going to be a pretty good blacksmith. You may remember him from vanilla. He was the secret ghost NPC that was outside of the Blackrock Depths instance, the one who gave you the quest for the key to the place. It wasn't exactly hidden since he was located on the way to the instance, so players kind of naturally found him after a corpse run, but a pretty unique way to give you a quest, I think. Anyways, he was the creator of Ironfoe, and it was passed down to the great-great-grandfather of Reginald Windsor, and if this name sounds familiar to you, this is the guy who was instrumental in the Onyxia attunement chain for the Alliance back in the day. The hammer was passed down to him, but he was captured in the Blackrock Depths, and you had to rescue him and take him to Stormwind, where he exposed Katrana Prestor as Onyxia, where he was then turned into Reginald Windscorched. But when he was captured, the leader of the Dark Iron Dwarves, Emperor Thorson, took Ironfoe to wield for himself, and adventurers could loot it from his corpse if they were lucky. And when I say lucky, I mean really lucky, because this thing was rare, having around a 1% drop rate, and considering that he was the last boss in an excruciatingly long dungeon, seeing someone with it was like seeing a unicorn. And unlike Sul'Thraze, it was actually good. Really good, in fact, because of the proc, which gave not just 1, but 2 extra attacks on your next swing. Typically, rogues and fury warriors were the lucky recipients. Hey, hunters can't use maces, so luckily this one is safe from their wrath. And still obtainable today as far as I know, although the proc has been nerfed to just 1 extra attack. Dragon's Call was a unique sword, found in the Great Sunken Temple dungeon. Again, epic quality, but what made this one special was that it had a chance to summon a dragon whelp to assist you. Back then, the only classes you saw that had pets were the hunter and warlock, and shamans if you count totems, and these pet summoning items were much less commonplace as they are now. It was very handy, and you could summon up to 3 whelps at a time if you were lucky enough, and they would cast these green bolts of lightning at your enemies for some decent damage. And it wasn't unique, so if you were crazy enough to farm 2 of them, you could technically get an army of 6 whelps to serve as your personal escort and wreck anyone in your way. It dropped from the Shade of Aranicus, which was the final boss, and it was much more annoying to get than it is today. Back then there were more floors to this dungeon, and scattered throughout the area, you had these trolls who were channeling a protection spell on Aranicus, so you had to track them down, take them out, along with the Prophet boss before you could attack them. So similar to Thorson, this weapon was rare not just due to the low drop rate, but by how unfriendly it was to farm since the dungeon was so long. The look is quite nice in my opinion, sort of the same vein as Lincoln's sword. It looks epic, but realistic and not super over the top, which fits some people's transmogs, I'm sure. I would say that mainly rogues or warriors were the lucky recipients of this, but again, you gotta keep in mind that epics were epic back then, and combining that with the fact that nobody knew what they were doing, it was kind of a free-for-all, and if someone could equip it, they would roll on it. So I'm sure there were a fair share of mages and warlocks and other casters, and everyone's favorite class running around with this back in the day. Hey, my old guildmaster said that hunters should have equal priority on Thunderfury, so I'm pretty sure this was fair game to them as well. Damn hunters. You know, a weapon is pretty substantial if it has an heirloom made after it. The Headmaster's Charge was a pretty popular caster weapon back in the day. It dropped off of the Dark Master Gandling in the level 60 dungeon, Scholomance. He was the final boss there, and what made it special, honestly, was its look. It was a staff adorned with bone spurs and a Diablo horned skull at the top. At the time, there wasn't anything like it, and it definitely turned heads. It also had a special on-use effect that increased the intellect of you and any nearby party members, which made you pretty popular. The original staff is no longer in the game, unfortunately, due to the Scholomance revamp in Pandaria, so the only wielders are the select few who farmed it out before then. You can still get the transmog via the re-release Headmaster as well, or like I mentioned, the heirloom staff. Earlier we went over Quel'Serrar, which was the one-handed tanking sword that we got from the Dharmal instance. We delivered a tome and an old blade to a lore master there in Slighted Dragon, but not before using its fire to temper it. But we learned from the lore keeper that there were many such blades forged from the fires of dragons, and one happened to pop up in the Wrath of the Lich King expansion, and just like Quel'Serrar, you could undertake a long set of tasks to restore it to its former glory. This one was called Quel'Delar, and is described as the sister blade to Quel'Serrar, and unlike a lot of weapons in this video, it's still obtainable today. It was a legendary sword held by the Quel'Delar elves, who were the High Elves. No, not that kind of High Elf. The ones of noble birth, also called Highborn. It was a mythical weapon of extreme power, and was used to slay Scourge in defense of the Silvermoon City against Arthas and his army of undead. It was wielded by Thalorian Dawnseeker, a High Elf warrior, where he fought to his eventual death at the hands of Arthas' Death Knights. He was slain while he heroically bought time for his allies to escape. After the dust had settled, and Prince Kil'thas returned and named the survivors of the battle Blood Elves, he took a regiment to Lordaeron to help the alliance against the Scourge. Thalorian's friend, Lanethel, took up Quel'Delar and carried on his legacy in the war against the Scourge. She was eventually sent to Icecrown to try to kill Arthas as the Lich King, but as you could see, things didn't turn out so well. But what happened to the blade? In patch 3.3, we got the Icecrown raid, in which Lanethel was a boss, the final in the Bloodwing, but the sword is nowhere to be seen. Well, after the Lich King killed her and brought her back as a minion in Undeath, she couldn't bear to wield it as it reminded her of her past life, so she shattered it into many pieces and scattered them throughout Icecrown, hoping to bury her past for good. One of these pieces is the Battered Hilt, which you could find in one of 3 dungeons for patch 3.3, the Forge of Souls, the Pit of Saron, or the Halls of Reflection. The enemies here have a very small chance to drop it, and it's quite pricey today. I spent about 40,000 so I could fully show you the quest line, so please like this video. Thank you very much. Do note that it is separated by faction, as the quest varies slightly depending if you're Horde or Alliance, so if you buy one, make sure that it's for your faction because it won't switch. So the hilt itself is the quest starter. You loot it, and you know that it isn't just some ordinary hilt, so you take it to your faction side of the Argent Tournament grounds in the Icecrown zone, Calidus Brightspear for the Alliance, and Miralian Sunblaze for the Horde. As elves, they note that it seems familiar, but they can't quite put their finger on it, despite the fact that they're in a location called Quel'Delar's Rest, with a hiltless sword nearby, but whatever. So to identify it, they ask you to go to the Wormrest Temple in Dragonblight and talk to an NPC named Coralistraz. Apparently he's quite knowledgeable about this sort of stuff, so surely he can help. You show him the hilt, and he identifies it as one of the prismatic dragon blades that they forged, just like Quel'Serrar, but he can't name the specific blade. He says that someone beat you to it, and he already lended out his reference book. We get a visit from Caligos, who's distrustworthy of you because of the whole Dragon Soul thing. Come on, that was a long time ago. Luckily, Alexstrasza backs you up, and that you'll totally use it for good. You're instructed to head on over to your factions in Dalaran and speak to Arcanist Tybelin for the Alliance and Magister Hathril for the Horde, and from these NPCs, you learn that the opposite faction is gathering intel on the sword as well, and they can be found in the Swords of Dalaran. So you go there, murder that person, loot the intel, and you learn that the person who got the Wormrest tome is to deliver it to Icecrown after meeting an NPC in the opposing faction's hub in Dalaran. The place is heavily guarded, so you can't just go in guns blazing. Instead, we get a disguise in the form of a tabard from the mage, Shandy Glassgleam, also found in the town. In exchange, though, he needs you to do some laundry. Hey, I told you this quest was epic. But you get the tabard, and it lets you slip by the guards to trick the Magister into giving you the tome. And now that you finally have it, you return to your NPC in Quel'Delar's Rest, where they read through it, trying to figure out what the Dragon Blade is. But suddenly, you're interrupted by Lanethil herself, where she confirms that the nearby sword is indeed Quel'Delar.
Is this
Quel'Delar.
really...
As Quel'Serrar was forged by the dragons and given to the Kaldori, its twin, Quel'Delar, was given to my people. The king bestowed the blade upon my friend, the Lorien Dawnseeker. But even Thalorian's skill and Quel'Delar's magic could not save Silvermoon from the might of the Scourge. Thalorian fell before the gates of the Sunwell, buying time for others to escape. After the battle, I recovered the sword from the field. I bore it to Northrend in the service of my prince, seeking to avenge our people's defeat. Arthas shattered our forces and took the most powerful of us into his service as the San'lain. My memories of Thalorian went cold, and so did his blade. It was I who brought Quel'Delar here to return it to its makers. In breaking the weapon, so did I break its power. Quel'Delar will never serve another.
She casts some sort of spell on the blade and disappears. It's broken, but it can be restored. For the first step, you're set to the Pit of Saren dungeon in the Icecrown Citadel. In here, the Lich King has skeletal miners harvesting a powerful ore called Saronite. You need to collect 5 bars from them, along with a hammer from the Forge Master Garfrost boss, also found in the same dungeon. And using this hammer and the bars and the remnants of Quel'Delar, you reforge the weapon to return it to its original shape, but the blade itself is still brittle and unstable, so the next step is to temper it. Instead of Dragon's Breath, this time you head into another 3.3 dungeon, this time the Forge of Souls, and you go through the entire instance, and at the end you dip the blade into a Crucible of Souls to temper it, but something's still missing. It's lacking the power it once held, and you feel it pulling you as if calling you somewhere. And it ends up that the answer is the last dungeon, the Halls of Reflection. Upon accepting the quest, you get a debuff called Quel'Delar's Compulsion, which you have until you finish it. It doesn't do anything negative, it just tells you to get your butt to the halls. Entering the dungeon, you see Frostmourne right in front of you in Sword's Rest, and suddenly in its presence, the spirit of Uther the Lightbringer appears and tells you to stop and not to carry it any further. So, of course, carrying the blade further, it flies into the air, and you're given a little mini-boss here where you and your party have to subdue it. And if you're successful, Uther appears once more and gives you the following dialogue.
You have forged this blade from Saronite, the very blood of an old god. The power of the Lich King calls to this weapon. Each moment you tarry here, Quel'Delar drinks in the evil of this place. There is only one way to cleanse this sword. Make haste for the Sunwell, and immerse the blade in its waters. I can resist Frostmourne's call no more.
Okay, so maybe using the blood of an old god wasn't such a good idea after all. You return to your faction NPC with this information, and by Uther's instruction, you're sent to the Sunwell to finally cleanse the blade. You talk to an NPC there named Haldren Brightwing, and after explaining the situation, he still doesn't allow you inside to cleanse it, but instead he sends you to the site where the original wielder, Thalorian Dawnseeker, fell in battle. You arrive at the site, examine his remains, and you see his death play out before you, where he sacrifices himself to buy time for his men to retreat. You get to play a role in this, and you have to defend him against the spirits of the past. He gives you his blessing, and you take it back to Haldren, where he finally agrees to permit you access to the Sunwell, and he escorts you under heavy guard. And here you can get a couple of different scenarios. If you're not a Blood Elf, the Lord of Quel'Thalas, Lor'themar, attempts to take the blade himself, and he's thrown back as the Quel'Delar refuse him. You're encased in a prison of ice, and you almost get into an altercation. But if you are a Blood Elf, Lor'themar simply inspects the blade and willingly hands it to you in respect of your heritage, as you can see here. Kind of a cool little detail they added, I think. Regardless though, you're given the blade to return to your faction NPC at Quel'Delar's Rest, and they send you back to Dalaran, where you're given a choice of a few different variants of the sword. The Might of the Faithful for two-handed strength DPS, the Ferocity of the Scorned for agility, a hunter stat stick basically, and the Cunning of Shadows for one-handed agility. And there's also the Lens of the Mind for casters. And that's it. You've restored the legendary Quel'Delar to its former glory, and you're announced as the wielder of it to the whole city, and you also get an achievement for your troubles. But even if you can't wield swords, you can still get some nifty weapons by sort of trading it in. There's a one-handed agility mace called the Cudgel of Furious Justice, a caster mace, the Hammer of Purified Flame, and the two-handed agility mace, the Lightborn Spire. So it's very similar to Quel'Serrar in a lot of ways. They're both dragon blades. You get them from a rare quest starter and rebuild them from these broken shadows of their former selves. One of the big differences is that Quel'Delar is tied to all 5-man content, whereas Quel'Serrar was of course done in the 40-man Onyxia raid. But on the other hand, Quel'Delar was a much longer chain with more story. Atiesh is to casters as Ashbringer is to paladins. It's the ultimate caster weapon, firmly etched into Warcraft's mythology and lore. It's made appearances in the books, the movie, and of course World of Warcraft itself, wielded by iconic characters such as Egwene, the Last Guardian, Medivh, Khadgar. It's the weapon of choice for the Guardians of Tirisfal. Its appearance is simple, at least in comparison to some of these other items. It's a long wooden staff, reinforced with arcane magic, and stylized with a raven carved into the head, the symbol of the Guardians. Not only does it serve as a conduit of power for its wielder, but it's also capable of opening a portal to Karazhan, the former home of the Last Guardian, and even allowing the transformation into the form of a raven for transportation. It holds incredible power, but only the strongest can bring it out to its full potential. After Medivh's corruption and death, the weapon was cursed and passed around to various members of the Kirin Tor, the mages of Dalaran, but anyone who wielded it died shortly after. In light of this, and with the line of guardians coming to a close, the Kirin Tor judged the weapon to be unwieldable, and they locked it away behind barriers of magic in their city of Dalaran. And on top of this, since it was such a powerful artifact, a guardian would also keep a watchful eye over it and protect it from any would-be thieves. It laid there for many years until the Eredar demon lord, Archimonde, attacked the city. A failsafe triggered with the barrier guarding Atiesh, and the staff was shattered into many pieces and spread throughout the world. There were 40 shards in total, collected by the Scourge, and the archaeologist Bran Bronzebeard found the base, which he then lost to the old god Cthulhu when he was exploring the Temple of Ahn'Qiraj. And Kel'Thuzad, the Lich Lord and commander of Naxxramas, held the raven head of the staff, which brings us to the events of World of Warcraft. This weapon was obtainable by players within the original Naxxramas, which was released in patch 1.11 and removed in patch 3.0.2 in light of its remake in the Wrath of the Lich King expansion. It was the first caster legendary in the game, and the first one that wasn't based more around RNG like Thunderfury and Sulfurous, for instance. As mentioned, it all started in the Naxxramas raid. This was of course the final raid tier 4 Vanilla WoW, and it was appropriately the toughest out of all of them. Nearly every boss was this extreme challenge, and with AQ40 being the previous raid, it was like the 1-2 death punch to raiding guilds back then. Very few cleared it before the release of the Burning Crusade expansion. Part of this was due to Burning Crusade being announced so quickly after Naxxramas released. At this point, everybody knew that any gear they got would be quickly replaced in their journey from 60 to 70, so there was very little motivation to trudge through it, let alone complete a legendary staff. So only the most dedicated and skilled would clear through all of it, and even fewer would see Atiesh completed before the release of the Burning Crusade. So, as difficult as it was to complete, it was also pretty straightforward. As mentioned before, the Scourge captured the fragments of Atiesh after its destruction in Dalaran, and they ended up in the hands of the actual bosses of the raid, and each one had a chance to drop a legendary item called a Splinter of Atiesh. Reading the tooltip, you saw that if you combined 40 of these, you could reform the frame, and only one person could loot these at once, so guilds had to somehow pick just one person to receive it. Usually this was done with the old DKP system, as well as veteran status, rank status. No matter what though, you can bet that there was drama to be found since it was such a highly sought after weapon. But the lucky classes that could end up using it were the Druid, Priest, Warlock, and of course the Mage. So you raided and raided and raided, and once you had all 40 shards, just as promised, you form a legendary item called the Frame of Atiesh, which is a quest starter, and clicking on it would send you to everybody's favorite bronze drake, Anachronos. You may remember him as the main quest giver for the Scepter of the Shifting Sands questline. You could find him outside of the then closed Caverns of Time, and before you could talk to him, you had to be neutral with the Brood of Nozdormu faction, which you typically had if you were actively raiding AQ40, so it was kind of a non-issue. The only tricky part was that the quest didn't actually mention Anachronos. It just said, go find somebody who can cleanse the frame. Yeah, it's that classic vanilla vagueness. With no quest markers, it was no easy feat. But either on your own or with the help of the internet, you eventually tracked him down, and he remarks that the staff still holds great evil, but to cleanse it, they must first fully assemble it. So he gives you a pretty simple follow-up quest. Obtain the base from the final boss of the AQ40 raid, Cthulhu, and the head from the final boss of Naxxramas, Kel'Thuzad. You know, an old god and lieutenant of the Lich King. Just typical stuff. So, like I said, really straightforward, but insanely difficult. I won't go on and on of how tough this was, but I will note that even though it was one tier behind, AQ40 was still very tough. In fact, when it first released, Cthulhu was thought to be mathematically impossible, even with the best gear and perfect execution, and in fact he was only killed after a big nerf. The only upside was that it was at least a 100% drop rate as long as you had the quest. So a challenge that only the best could complete, and if they were successful, there was just one more step to cleanse it. It's still the epitome of all evil, and it'll destroy any wielder, so the next step was to head to the Stratholme dungeon with 4 party members to purify it. Near the undead side, next to the fountain, you could find a patch of consecrated earth. The quest holder would have to stand on top of this spot and perform a short ritual, and at the end, a demon named Atiesh would spawn. This was the evil that was inhabiting the staff for all of these years at the behest of Sargeras. So you had to take it down to finally cleanse it once and for all. It was a pretty tough fight with just 5 people. Interestingly enough, the demon himself dual-wielded a legendary. There were dual swords called Endonisis, the Reaper of Souls. If a player disarmed the demon during the fight, he would actually drop it on the ground and you would be able to wield it against him. It had an eye level of 100 and some crazy attack power, but it was a conjured item and it was only usable in Stratholme, and it disappeared once you exited the dungeon. What a tease. But if you're successful, you returned to Anachronos, and he gives you the cleansed Atiesh as a reward. Each class gets a slightly different version, but in general it had tons of spell power, stamina, intellect, spirit hit, crit, and an aura that buffed your party members, which was pretty unique. And you could also open a portal to Karazhan in the Deadwind Pass that you and your party members could use, although there really wasn't a reason to be there until the Burning Crusade, when the raid was actually released. Still handy though, since traveling in vanilla was so time consuming, so any portal like this was very welcome. The only thing missing in World of Warcraft is the Raven form. Maybe they didn't want to steal the Druid's thunder, I don't know. Although it is worth noting that periodically you'll get this visual effect with ravens flying over your head, so it at least has a nod to it. And as I mentioned, this was obtainable all the way until patch 3.0.1 in Wrath, when the raid was re-released, and anyone who obtained it before them got themselves a feat of strength to show off. Similar to other weapons in this video, it also has a card dedicated to it in the TCG. Appropriately, only the Druid, Priest, Warlock, and Mage classes can use it, and it also has its own special card in Hearthstone, although it's only usable in the One Night in Karazhan expansion set. Like I said, this also appeared in the Warcraft movie, and they ended up having an auction for all of the props, and this one sold for nearly $5,000. Let's hope it was cleansed first. Today, lore-wise, it's in the hands of Archmage Khadgar, so it gets a little awkward if a player wielder interacts with him. But a little fun fact is that if you entered the Burning Crusade Karazhan and you walked into the Shade of Aran's room with Atiesh equipped, you get some extra dialogue. And they also revisited this in the Legion remake with the Shade of Medivh fight. Very few survive today, as you would imagine, so if you see one out in the wild, make sure you press F to pay respects. Shadowmourne was one of 2 legendaries in Wrath. Players may recognize it as the sister blade to Frostmourne, which is the unholy rune blade that corrupted Prince Arthas Menethil and turned him into an agent of the Lich King. He found it in his campaign to Northrend and took it as his weapon to take vengeance against the Dreadlord Mal'Ganis. The blade took hold of him, however, and he lost control of his own will, eventually leading him to becoming the Lich King at the behest of Frostmourne itself. Similar in design, Shadowmourne is etched with unholy runes, and it gains power from the souls of its victims, and it takes a powerful wielder to control it, lest they suffer the same fate as the Fallen Prince. The only difference from Frostmourne, of course, being that it's an axe rather than a sword. It was, and still is, obtainable by players in the Ice-Crowned Citadel, the home of the Lich King himself, and the expansion's big final raid. Only 3 classes could obtain it though, and that's the Warrior, Paladin, and most appropriately the Death Knight, the new class for the expansion. It involved a fairly long quest chain that spanned both inside and outside of the raid, and at the time, only the best of the best would be able to make it through this gauntlet to finally obtain it. You got it from the current leader of the Death Knights, Darian Mograine, near the entrance. To accept it, you need friendly reputation with the Ashen Verdict, which is a faction that's tied to the raid, and you got this pretty quickly just by killing trash and bosses. You can get it after a few runs of just clearing all of the trash up until the first boss, Merogar, and then resetting over and over. Once you had that done, you could grab the quest, and the objective is to build the base of Shadowmourne by getting some very specific reagents. First is 25 Primordial Serenite. These are rare reagents dropped by bosses held within the raid. It's the heart and blood of the old god Yogg-Saron, hence the name, and they'll be handy in creating an evil soul-devouring weapon of unimaginable power. When it was current content, these were high in demand, as you would imagine, and they were quite pricey as a result. As for the next 2 reagents, you needed the blood of Rotface and Festergut. These are 2 bosses held fairly deep into the raid in the Unholy Wing, and they only dropped on 25-man mode. You may recall that it was during this expansion is when they first introduced the option of running 10-man versions of every raid. They were a bit easier, so to keep the chain challenging, they limited a lot of this stuff to 25-man only. And the last item you needed was Light's Vengeance, which was the discarded weapon of Prince Arthas when he found Frostmourne. As I mentioned, he made a paid class switch from Paladin to Death Knight and tossed aside this weapon in favor for the Rune Blade. Paying a visit to Dragonflight, you'll see the landing spot for Arthas' army and the remains of the ships that he burned long ago, and in a nearby cavern you'll find the former resting place of Frostmourne. The weapon laid before you is convenient as can be, but upon walking up to it, you find that it's a trap. The Lich King doubles as a master of bamboozling and encases you with chains of ice. You're ambushed with a seemingly unbeatable swarm of Lovelady zombies and an undead necromancer. But to your right is Light's Vengeance, and if you run up to it and harness its holy power, it'll fly up into the air and smite any nearby ghoul and break the necromancer's immunity shield. You then engage him one-on-one, and if you're successful, you'll find Light's Vengeance free for the taking on the ground right next to you. And with this, you have all 4 reagents. Returning to Mograine, he takes Light's Vengeance, and along with the blood and the Serenite, he forges it into a weapon called Shadow's Edge. So for now, this will be your tool for harvesting souls, and you'll slowly empower it to transform it into Shadowmourne. It is an actual usable weapon, as you can see, and was quite good at the time. In its original state, it had some strength, stamina, red sockets, critical strike, and armor penetration, which is a stat they removed a long time ago. This would be the equivalent of 25-man raid loot at the time, and you needed to have it equipped for the rest of the chain to complete it. Mograine warns you of the weapon's power over you, and that you must not let it take control, and if you fail, it's his duty to deliver you from this life. For the next quest, you're tasked with consuming the souls of 50 of the Lich King's minions within the raid. This was originally a staggering 1,000, and it was only changed later for convenience sake for people returning to the expansion. But this was done just by killing enemies in here with Shadow's Edge equipped, so originally it took many resets to knock out, and it was at this point that the Lich King would start taunting you and trying to get you to succumb to the will of Shadow's Edge. Once you successfully harvest all 50 souls, you're led into the first real challenging part of the quest chain, and that's Unholy Infusion. Shadowmourne requires the power of 3 elements: blood, frost, and unholy. These powers lay dormant, and you need to infuse it with all 3 to bring it to its full potential. For unholy empowerment, you have to venture deep into the Plague Wing and defeat the 3rd and final boss there, Professor Putricide. During the fight, the person on the quest line had to have Shadow's Edge equipped and then click on the table to transform into this abomination, and then you would have to go over these puddles of green slime that grow throughout the room and absorb them, and when you did that enough, you would be able to infuse the power into Shadow's Edge. Your transformation would wear off, and then you would have to just kill the boss from there. And you needed this abomination for the fight, so this was like doing a hard mode, and it required a lot of coordination with your guild. Doing it today is pretty trivial, as you would imagine. The only obstacle really is that if you're solo, the boss despawns once you transform, so the only way to get around it is to be a death knight with a pet, or just have a friend with you. But with this was the first element properly infused. The next step was the dreaded blood infusion. Similar to Unholy, you had to complete this on the final boss of the Bloodwing. This time it's Blood Queen Lanethil. She has a mechanic where she bites a player at random, and after 1 minute, that player turns into a vampire and attacks the raid unless he satiates himself by biting another player, infecting them with the same debuff. So for this part, you need to bite 3 raid members total and then kill the Blood Queen. This was easier said than done though, since for each person you bite, you take a stacking damage over time effect, and at 3 stacks it required a couple of healers dedicated to keeping you alive. Also note that in any of these 3 quests, if the wielder died, they failed. So once again, a lot of coordination was required, and it really was a team effort to get through it. But with this, there's just 1 element left, and that's Frost. You needed to face the final boss of the Frostwing, Sindragosa, and get hit by a Frost Breath 3 times while wielding Shadow's Edge. Again, another hard mode here, as only the tanks were supposed to get hit by your breath, so you had to have some more healers at the ready dedicated to the wielder to keep them alive. And just like all of the other parts of the chain, all of this had to be done on 25-man mode. As challenging as all of this was, it got even harder with the next step, which was the Splintered Throne quest. This was easily the most time-consuming part of the chain, because you had to collect 50 of an item called a Shadow Frost Shard. When Kil'jaeden turned Ner'zhul into the Lich King, he created an icy vessel which kept his spirit under control, and Arthas eventually broke this prison, and these shards were scattered across the Citadel and are now held by the Lich King's lieutenants. Only one shard dropped per boss, so if you had 2 Shadow's Edge wielders in your raid, you'd have to think of a way to divvy them out. For the sake of progression, most guilds just focused on one person first, and once they finished their quest, they would move on to the next, rather than splitting the shards evenly or doing a random roll. So this stage in general took a very long time since there are 12 bosses within the raid. It could be as low as 5 weeks if you were extremely lucky, or it could take several months if you were extremely unlucky. The sweet spot for most people is around 2-ish months, I would say, with average luck. So shard by shard, and slowly but surely, you moved closer and closer to the blade's completion. And months later, after you had collected 50 of them, you returned to Mograine, and he offered you the quest, Empowerment, where he would take the shards and Shadow's Edge from you to a nearby forge, and with a small explosion of power, Shadowmourne is born. The weapon in its original form had a slow 3.7 speed with a whopping 344 damage per second. It held a hefty amount of strength, stamina, critical strike, armor penetration, and 3 sockets which held any gem of any color back when gems had certain colors and you got bonuses if you matched them properly. It's very similar to Shadow's Edge, but just with more stats. And since this weapon is basically the epitome of all evil, it also has this soul harvesting effect, just like its sister blade. Your melee attacks have a chance to drain a soul fragment, giving you some strength, and when you acquire 10 of them, you unleash an effect called Chaos Bane, which dealt some shadow damage split between all nearby enemies. And that wasn't even the end of it. Even after getting this legendary, you got a follow-up quest to kill the Lich King, and to loot an item called a sealed chest from his body. Returning to Mograine one final time, he unlocks the chest for you, which contains mementos of the fallen prince's past, showing that through all of his evil deeds and nature, he was never able to truly let go of who he once was. You'd return these mementos to their respective owners located inside the instance.
Father.
Daria, my son. At last, I am able to lay my eyes upon you again.
Father, I feared for your sanity.
The Lich King tormented me without end, Daria. Endlessly, he sought to break my will, to force me to serve him, to bind me to his blade. Finally, when events demanded his full attention, he left me. The one memory I clung to, Daria, the one thought that kept me from giving in, it was your sacrifice, my son, that again saved me from eternal peril.
Father, for you, I would give my life 1,000 times.
Oh, lad. How I miss those endless days in Lordaeron. Sharpening your skill with this dull blade. Forging you into a weapon meant to withstand the demands of a great destiny. Heh. You sure put them skills to use, didn't you, lad? If only I'd been able to stop you that day. How different things might have been. If only I'd have never discovered that accursed blade. Farewell, Arthas, my brother.
Arthas. Alas, hero of Azeroth, you give me a greater gift than you know. Long have I struggled to forgive the prince for his terrible transgressions. My soul has been racked with unbearable anxiety, dark thoughts, distancing me from the light. I recall clearly the gleam of pride in his eye as he stood before me, eager to defeat the enemies of the light. Eager to defend his people, no matter the cost. It is this memory of Arthas that I choose to keep in my heart. I shall always be in your debt, friend. Thank you.
So, it is done. I had not dared to trust my senses. Too many times has the Lich King made me to be a fool. Finally, he has been made to pay for the atrocities he imposed upon my people. May Azeroth never fail to remember the horrible price we paid for our weakness, for our pride. But what now, hero? What of those freed from his grasp, but still shackled to their mortal coils? Leave me. I have much to ponder.
What's this? He kept it. All this time, he kept it. I knew. I sensed a part of him still alive, trapped, struggling. Oh, Arthas. Perhaps he might someday remember what he once was. By the light, may he at last find rest, free from the icy grip of that terrible blade.
As rewards for all of this, you got a mount called the Crimson Death Charger, the epic quality Tabard of the Silver Hand, a toy that turns you into a Frost Dwarf, a locket that teleports you to Dalaran, and a music box which summons some banshees who sing you a song. You can choose to keep all of this to yourself, or alternatively you could sell them on the auction house since they're not soulbound, and they fetch a pretty penny, so it's actually an interesting way to farm some gold. But that's the Shadowmourne questline in its entirety. Needless to say, this legendary was quite powerful at the time, dwarfing every other weapon in the game by far. If you saw someone wielding it in Arena, you were in for some pain. That's all I can remember. It was the first expansion where they started giving out legendaries with long quest chains like this, rather than just lucky drops like with Vanilla in the Burning Crusade. The only exception I can think of is Thunderfury, which technically had a quest, but to start it, you had to get very lucky and get not only one, but 2 legendary drops, and even still, that quest was just 2 parts long. So with Wrath, they switched to this more consistent, slow but steady style with shards or reagents that you collect slowly over time, and also introducing challenges of both solo and group content. This style would continue until Legion, where they went back to the random drop system, which a lot of people didn't like. As with many other items on this list, it got its own trading card in the TCG. As you can see, it gains power from fallen allies, playing into that whole soul harvesting shtick. And, as I said, still obtainable today, and while it doesn't have any actual use in current day content, it has an interesting story tied to it. And those items that you get from the final part nets you quite a lot of gold, as I said, and you can actually get some use out of it with time-walking dungeons, since it scales you down anyways, but only in the Burning Crusade and Wrath, since they're, of course, 70 and 80, so kind of a neat way to put some use to it. We've been showing off the best weapons in the game, but how about the worst? You can't have good items without the bad, so next we'll cover the biggest disappointments. Items that, if another player saw that she had equipped, they would shake their heads. And what better way to start off than with Vendor Strike. This was a polearm type weapon found in the first raid, the Molten Core, specifically from the Sulfuran Harbinger boss, and it's quite the unique case as well because it's a 2-in-1. You looted the base as Shadow Strike, but if you used it, it would transform into a new weapon entirely, but equally bad, Thunderstrike. So let me put you in the moment. It was the very beginning of the game. Nobody knew what they were doing, and these raids were mad scrambles for the mythical purple quality items. As I mentioned earlier, coming from dungeons, even a full set of blues was a status symbol for a good while here. So how could a purple, let alone a purple weapon, possibly be bad? Well, for a few reasons. First is due to the weapon speed. Both versions are 3.1, which is pretty fast for the time. Again, back then, generally, you wanted slow weapons. But aside from that, it also had a lower than usual DPS from other weapons in the raid. A direct comparison of an actual good two-hander is the Obsidian Edged Blade, which had a slower speed, great stats, and about 5 more DPS. Point 2 is the fact that there are no stats. Sometimes even if a weapon has a fast speed, they can still be handy for hunters to use for stats or something, but both effects are damaging procs, pretty unimpressive ones at that, with Shadow Strike having a lifesteal and Thunderstrike having this chain lightning effect. And lastly, it's simply because they're polearms, which was one of the least used weapon types. Only a few classes could even wield it, and as you may know, these were still the days of weapon skills. You had to level each one manually, and since there were so few polearms in the game, most people had a low skill in wielding them. So, because of this, players were eventually able to look past its shiny color, and it became the black sheep of weapons in vanilla. People preferred to call it Vendor Strike, or Nexus Strike, I've also heard, referring to the material that enchanters get when disenchanting it. But rest assured, if you were walking around with this back in the day, you'd be on the receiving end of some friendly ribbing. But looking past that, I personally look back to it quite fondly due to its uniqueness. I mean, how many items were there that transformed upon use? On the top of my head, as you saw, there's Anathema and Benediction, but that's pretty much it. So, it did suck, but at least it had some sort of redeeming quality of being unique and interesting. But something that just plain sucked was the Lion Horn of Stormwind, a trinket which when struck in combat has a 1% chance of increasing all party members' armor by 250. I feel like I don't really need to explain why this is so horrible, but I guess I'll do it anyways. At maximum level, 250 armor is nothing, let alone a 1% chance to proc it. It's about a 1% difference at max level if it's up. Armor was something that's skilled with level, but since this requires level 58 to equip it, it doesn't matter anyways. And the party member bonus can be effectively disregarded because only the tank should be getting hit with physical attacks anyways. And if that's not the case, 1% chance at 250 armor probably isn't going to save you. But hey, wait a second. We've overlooked something all these years. Can you see what we missed? That's right. It's not unique, so you can slap 2 of these bad boys on, and you'll be the horniest player in the game. Next up, we have another trinket, the Essence of Pure Flame. At this point, I'd like to remark just how few viable trinkets there were in the game. It seemed like per class you could count on one hand the ones that were even decent, so for a trinket to make the list it has to be pretty terrible. This one had just one effect. When struck in combat, inflict 13 fire damage to the attacker. Another item that got a nickname called the Essence of the Pure Nexus. In the group scene, if you're a tank, your main focus is on reducing damage taken, but it did have its niche use at least for AoE pulling like Hobbs, where you could power level some friends by gathering everything up and letting them damage themselves with thorns and stuff. So at least it's not completely useless like the Lion Horn. Next, we have something that really is useless. It's not an actual item though, so it may be cheating, but something that used to happen back in the day was that Shaman set pieces could drop for the Alliance players, and Paladin could drop for the Horde. Of course, it wasn't until the Burning Crusade that both factions could roll both classes, so there's not even an argument here. There is no saving grace. These items would literally be useless if they dropped for the wrong faction. I guess maybe aside from the Nexus Crystal. It's kind of hard to believe, honestly. Stuff like that would never pass today, but this actually happened. Like I said, vanilla itemization was interesting, to say the least, and it was eventually fixed, but the same problem arose with other pieces. For example, there were plenty of plate items that had intellect and caster-based stats, which were of course useless for the Horde, and on the Alliance you could get shaman-oriented gear with intellect mail armor, but at least paladins could still equip that without a big penalty. It wasn't a huge deal back in the day for classes to wear the wrong armor type just because it had good stats. In fact, if you're at all familiar with Classic, you'll see a lot of paladins walking around in cloth. In the old Leroy Jenkins video, they were trying to go for the priest shoulders for a paladin, in fact. But all of these items, as useless as they are, at least they aren't harmful to anyone but yourself. Who cares if a warrior's rocking Vendor Strike? Bless his heart, he's having fun. But there were some items that went beyond that. One of them is the Skullforged Reaver. At first glance, it doesn't seem bad. A decent weapon for an intro to raiding. It's blue, slower speed, which again is good for your main hand, and most important of all, it looks cool. It has this native purple glow to it, and if you sheath it, it went on your back, which was also pretty unique back then. It had this whole ninja thing going on if you had 2 of them equipped, which definitely gives it some style points. But the main worry here is its proc effect. Chance on hit, drains the target for 2 shadow damage every second, leeches that to the wielder, and lasts for 30 seconds. Aside from the fact that this just plain sucks, you'd much rather have stats. But what made it annoying was that it took up a debuff slot. Back then, debuffs were limited to 8 until patch 1.7 where it was increased to 16, and all 40 of the raid members shared these slots, so you had to sort of ration them for only the most important debuffs like Warrior Sunder Armor, Warlock's Curse of Elements, and so on. It was so bad that some guilds required you to even avoid certain talent builds, such as the Warrior's Deep Wounds, which procs off of crits. While this is good damage and useful for solo play or PvP, in raiding it took up a valuable debuff slot, so certainly you wouldn't want a weapon like this taking up a slot, and you'd probably have a talking to if you brought it into raid. I know, I did it back in the day. I brought this very same weapon into my first Molten Core run on my rogue, and the first thing the officers of the guild told me was to replace it after the raid because I was pushing off critical debuffs. But hey, at least I looked cool doing it. And lastly, we have the Spire of the Stone Shaper. So first off, another weapon that's still unique, but also quite worthless. Even worse actually, because it can get you killed quite easily, in fact. On use, it increases your armor by 1,000 for 10 seconds, but you can't cast spells or attack during the duration of it. It's bad. Next item. Okay, well, I guess I should explain why it's bad. I guess first starting with the targeted clientele. Tanking druids would be the most reasonable choice, I think, but something you have to understand with classic tanking is that threat was really hard to get. It's one of the reasons why warriors were the best tanks. It's because they had a huge arsenal of taunts and threat generators at their disposal, but druids and also paladins found it much harder to hold aggro on anything other than single target. So basically pacifying yourself for 10 seconds is like the last thing you want as a tank. The armor really doesn't matter if nothing's hitting you, and that's not even for tanks. I don't know, can you think for any staff-wielding class why you would want to basically pacify yourself for 10 seconds for a little bit of added physical defense? I can't. And worst of all, when you used it, it was a debuff, so you couldn't even click it off if you changed your mind. I think it's appropriate since it does more harm than good, but still, that's pretty hardcore. So for all intents and purposes, let's just call this one the Spire of the Group Wiper. The Corrupted Ashbringer. Like many others in this video, one of the most iconic weapons to ever exist in the game. Found only in the Nextramus raid, this was firmly out of reach for 99% of the player base for original vanilla World of Warcraft, but that didn't stop them from dreaming. It dropped off of the 4 Horsemen fight, who were found at the end of the Death Knight wing, and even if you were one of the few to make it to them, they were one of the hardest bosses in the entire raid, simply due to the fact that you needed 8 tanks to beat it, 2 for each horseman. Needless to say, they went unkilled for most guilds, and only a select few slack-jawed daffodils could say that they conquered the 4 horsemen, and even fewer could say that they obtained this mythical weapon, wielded by the great Alexandros Mograine. Ashbringer would become famous for its power to slay any undead creature, obliterating them into ash with a single swing. hence the name. Mograine was the former High Lord of the Silver Hand, which was an order of paladins created after the First War by Uther the Lightbringer. He first laid eyes on the Ashbringer in the form of a dark orb in the possession of a nameless warlock. An artifact of shadow, it was of no use to a paladin of the Silver Hand in its current form, and in an attempt to destroy it, Mograine and his companions purged the crystal with a holy spell, but instead of shattering it, it reacted to the light, and it became a physical manifestation of holy magic, which had the power to heal any wound and smite any undead creature. Mograine then traveled to Ironforge to ask the great smith, Magni Bronzebeard, to forge the weapon from the crystal, and thus the Ashbringer was born. It was then that he was appointed the High Lord of the Knights of the Silver Hand, and with Ashbringer in hand, he led the fight against the Lich King, slaying countless of his undead minions, no matter how powerful. Having caught wind of this, however, the Lich Lord, Quel'Serrar, hatched a devious plan. He had one of his agents corrupt Alexandros' son, Renault Mograine, and turned him to the side of the Lich King. He led his father to Stratholme, where he had set up a scourge ambush. Alexandros was able to fend them off, but after the battle, in complete exhaustion, he dropped his weapon, leaving him vulnerable, and, by the hands of his own son, was slain. It was then that the Ashbringer was corrupted into the dark form that we saw in-game. He would continue to wield it in death, but this time as an agent of Quel'Serrar, the very lich who turned his own son against him. So he was one of the 4 horsemen that you faced in the fight, with his compatriots being Thane Korthaz, Lady Blaumio, and Sir Zeliek, who were all former paladins who fell at the hands of the Scourge. As I said, it was a relentlessly difficult fight at the time. Each horseman had a stacking debuff, which would eventually one-shot you, so typically guilds used a strategy employing 8 tanks taunt-swapping whenever they got too high of stacks, although there were alternate and typically less practical strategies using fewer tanks, and if that wasn't enough, they were at the end of the Death Knight wing after the Instructor Resuvius and Gothic the Harvester fights, so even making it to them was an impossible feat for many. But the method of obtaining the weapon was pretty straightforward. It's not like Atiesh where you had to collect a bunch of splinters and then go on this quest chain, but rather it simply dropped from the fight. So it definitely was more common than the legendary staff, but it did have some unique properties. It had an impressive 90 damage per second with a slower 3.6 speed, and it was also one of the few weapons that had negative stats. It cursed the wielder with a penalty to stamina, which was definitely sizable. It also had some critical strike, a lifesteal proc, and most interesting is the affix on equip. It inflicts the will of the Ashbringer upon the wielder. This triggered a curse upon the player, and if they wielded it, they would occasionally hear whispers in their head from Mograine's damned spirit. So being the embodiment of all evil, basically, equipping it also made you temporarily hated with the Argent Dawn faction, and if they saw you wielding it, you would be attacked on sight. So players had to always be careful going to any Argent Dawn hub. Another unique thing with the weapon was that if you brought it into the Scarlet Monastery dungeon, its inhabitants would become friendly and stop in their tracks if they saw you walk by. And going into the Cathedral wing, you would find Renault Mograine, and if you had the blade equipped, you would trigger the following cutscene. Furthermore, if you were to enter the secret chamber holding the High Inquisitor Fairbanks, who bore witness to Alexandros' death, you would redeem his spirit and unlock a special dialogue where he hints that you may be able to restore the weapon to its former glory by visiting his other son in the Outland. As you may know, this fueled one of the biggest questions in gaming history, and that was, can you obtain the cleansed legendary Ashbringer in vanilla World of Warcraft? I remember at the time when the raid came out, people were going nuts, crawling all over Azeroth trying to find the secret and purifying it. Of course, the Outland wasn't out at this point, The Dark Portal in the Blasted Lands was just for show, and Fairbanks himself didn't even offer a quest. But that didn't stop players from scouring every pixel in the game. And what's worse was the fact that the weapon did actually exist in the game files, but it was only spawned through GM commands. Blizzard would even tease players by putting in other NPCs and books which referenced the weapon, or suggested that Nat Pagle knew of its location, which then prompted players to fish for it. It was one of the biggest scavenger hunts in gaming history, and Blizzard themselves said that it was a mistake to give players the corrupted counterpart in the first place. Due to all of these breadcrumbs, it's speculated that Blizzard did indeed have plans to make it available to players, but due to unknown reasons it was eventually scrapped, and all events related to the planned chain started and ended in the Scarlet Monastery. Even though the Might of Menethil ended up being the holy grail of two-handers in vanilla due to its notoriety and the potential for transformation into its legendary counterpart, the Corrupted Ashbringer was one of the most sought-after items in the game at the time, and just like the NPCs in the dungeon, if players saw you walk by with it, it would definitely catch their eye. It's been no longer obtainable, along with Atiesh, ever since the Wrath of the Lich King expansion, wherein Extremis was re-released as the first raid. In Atiesh's case, the questline was simply removed, but for the Corrupted Ashbringer, Alexandros lost his spot to the Baron Rivendare in the Four Horsemen fight, so with no Alexandros, there's no Corrupted Ashbringer to be found. So there was a period in time during the Burning Crusade where it was much easier to get, but still today in the retail version of the game it's extremely rare to see. I saw a total of one myself. Lore-wise, it fell into the hands of Darian Mograine, who would betray the Lich King at the Battle of Light's Hope Chapel in the intro series for Death Knights in Wrath, and after he was defeated, he tossed it to Tyrion Fordring, where it was then purified and used to fend off the Lich King.
Tyrion!
And later ultimately destroy him. And much later on in the Legion expansion, the Purified Ashbringer was of course given to players as their artifact weapon, and the Corrupted Ashbringer was an unlockable alternate appearance that you got through fishing, so I guess everything came full circle after all. But it's left quite behind a legacy, and like many others in this video, it saw its own card in the TCG, and it also saw a crossover as a lootable weapon once more in Diablo 3. Vanilla World of Warcraft. Released shortly after the dawn of MMOs, it was a time of discovery, wonder, and awful looking gear. Behold, the slayer of the elemental lord of fire, the conqueror of Nefarian, destroyer of the old god, bow before his ultimate might. It's charming in a way, but also a bit ridiculous, with Blizzard themselves even acknowledging it. In the Wrath of the Lich King Dalaran, in the sewers you would find the NPC High Warlord Uro. This is a reference to a player of the same name, and when spoken to, he remarks, "Only a fool would mock the appearance of my battle garb. This raiment of well-worn steel is from an ancient place of learning." Well, that's exactly what we're going to do today, but first let's lay down the ground rules. There are plenty of ugly weapons or armor pieces in the game, but something we should take into consideration is how and where you get them. This mace is awful, but it's from a level 10 quest, so it makes sense. That's fine. It's only when something drops from an ultra high-end raid, or is crafted from the bones of 10,000 virgins at the top of a volcano, is when the expectation of looking semi-presentable is set. So, with that being said, let's start with the granddaddy of ugly weapons in the game, and that's the Bone Reaver's Edge. Forged from the bones of those who fell before the elemental lord of fire, Ragnaros, this weapon boasts an impressive 75.9 damage per second, 16 stamina, 1 crit, and a proc where you ignore 700 of your enemy's armor for 10 seconds, stacking 3 times. It is one of the best two-handers in the entire game, and every warrior's wet dream. And it looks like a broken popsicle stick. Seriously, it's the size of a one-hander. Here's the Bone Reaver's Edge, and here's the Skullforge Reaver. My theory is that in the midst of designing it, the artist got distracted or they went on lunch break and just forgot to finish it. That explains the jagged edge and the poop color. But the good thing was that it kept you low-key on the battlefield. Like, who are you gonna attack? The guy with the giant glowing orange mace, or someone who looks like they just dinged 60 and got their green quest sword. And that's not even a joke. It shares the same model as the level 30 Whirlwind sword from the Warrior quest. It's just a different color. But regardless of its look, to this day, the Bone Reaver's Edge still gives warriors a boner. Next up, we have some armor. Deep within the Blackrock Mountain is the Blackrock Depths, an entire city carved along the side of the home of the Fire Lord and ruled by the great Emperor Thorson. Those brave enough to fight their way through the city and face the king himself are rewarded with a variety of powerful relics with which to equip themselves. You have the epic Ironfoe hammer, which grants 2 extra attacks on your next swing as a proc. There's the deadly Dreadforge Retaliator, a nice beginner two-hander here, or a cloak called the Emperor's New Cape. Let's see what it looks like. Wait. Okay, pardon my French here, but what the F? Well, that's one way to save time. What, they forget to put a model in? Well, actually, there's an interesting story behind this. It's a reference to a short story, The Emperor's New Clothes, by 1800s Danish writer Hans Christian Andersen. In an unnamed world, there was this vain but simple emperor. One day, a couple of scoundrels hatched a plan. They convinced him that they were master tailors and that they were capable of crafting clothes so fine and elaborate that they were invisible to the naked eye to those who were either too stupid or incompetent to appreciate their beauty. They requested extravagant and very expensive materials with which to make the clothes, such as fine silk and gold thread, and after weeks of stalling, they presented the invisible clothes to the emperor, and to his dismay, he saw nothing. But he wasn't a fool, he thought. He wouldn't have his servants believe that he's too incompetent to see his luxurious garments. So he played along. He stripped himself of his garb and put on this magnificent clothing he was promised. So he stood there, naked, in front of his people for all to see, and they thought to themselves, our king would not think of us as fools, so they praised the beautiful fabric and patterns. It's a story of vanity and forsaking free thought for the sake of being accepted by those around you and buying into mob mentality. So, long story short, this cloak is a reference to the tale, The Emperor's New Cape. Does it really belong on this list? I don't know, it's debatable, but I just felt like telling the tale. Big whoop, want to fight about it? The loot for the Molten Core was thrown together quite quickly, and up until patch 1.4, you'd be able to obtain both Tier 1 and Tier 2 sets from the raid. In this patch, Tier 2 was removed from everything but Ragnaros and Onyxia, later to be saved for the next raid tier, which was the Blackwing Lair. But that wasn't the only thing that was different with these sets. We all know about the Tier 1 sets, which were all completely unique models and tailored to match their respective classes to provide style as well as stats. So Tier 2 you would think would be an improvement in both areas. While in general they were more powerful, in the looks department they were less than impressive, and players were disappointed to find that every single one were recolors of low-level questing armor as the developers ran out of time and they scrambled to throw together these fashion disasters. The Wrath set used that old horned helmet that you see all over the game. Priests turned into Aladdin cosplayers. Druids roleplayed as Cabbage. Warlocks copied priests. Well, someone has to change. The only one that looked decent, in my opinion, was the Rogue's Bloodfang, which was just a red recolor of their Shadowcraft set. Can you believe that it was as late as patch 1.9 that these were finally updated to the sets that we all know and love, and players were finally able to check the Show Helmet option in the interface menu? Lesser known still, however, are the Tier 1 models. So, you've finally done it. You've grinded for months, and at least you've obtained level 60. You're in dungeons that held the most difficult challenges you've ever faced, and you're ready to take it to the next level, the Molten Core. Not a 5-man, but rather a 40-player raid, where only the most elite players could overcome. Such an extreme task deserves extreme rewards, however. Behold the legendary armaments of the core, the fabled artifacts guarded so preciously by the minions of Ragnaros, the Defender of McDonald's. We have what are essentially 4 unique armor sets, one for cloth, one for leather, mail and plate, all the same model but sharing different colors for each armor type. The crazy few who were able to clear the Molten Core fast enough were wowed by these amazingly fashionable armor sets, and it wasn't until patches 1.3 through 1.6 that they were downgraded to these walking abominations that we know today. And even the Tier 0 dungeon set had some awkward looking placeholders. Prior to patch 1.4, this is what they looked like. As you could see, some are completely different and others just had a different head. The only exception here is the rogue, which was complete in its introduction. The real eyesores here, though, I think, are the priests and shamans, and to a lesser extent the hunters. Like many others on the list, it looks like they never dinged past level 40. I remember on my paladin seeing level 60s with the awesome winged lightforged helmet, and wanting to grind to the max level so I could get one myself, and being disappointed that by the time I reached it, it was changed to the McDonald's hat. Call me a hipster, but I always thought that the original paladin helmet looked way cooler. In fact, there is a little neat reference to this old school set in the old town of Stormwind. Here you can find an NPC named Dave the Quick who has the original set, helmet and all, and he even has the old school Seal of Righteousness from Classic, one of the few survivors of all of the pruning that went on throughout the game. But there are even more model updates. As mentioned previously, the loot in the Molten Core was thrown together rather quickly, and there were a handful of random items that also received graphical updates in the same patch as the Tier 2 upgrade. Here's the original Corehound Tooth model. Well, maybe it was a baby Corehound. If two Corehounds have sex, is it considered a foursome? The original drill bore disc had an actual drill attachment, although it looks like you'd take it with you to kill Hogger. The original obsidian edged blade was just a bit more curvy. Did you see those warriors from Azzinoth? They've got curved swords. Curved swords. You know, I got something similar going on with my, never mind. Perdition's blade also saw an update, changing from a level 20 dagger with fiery enchant to Ragnaros' fingernail, and the Staff of Dominance was 50% less dominant. It was just a copy of the Staff of Jordan, but with a little extra glow. That was their band-aid, I guess. It's a level 30 model, but let's just put a special glow on it and call it a day. Speaking of which, the Gutgore Ripper looked like a random level 30 dagger, but it still had that black glow. Here you can see a rogue with Gutgore, Corehound Tooth, and Bloodfang helmet, all with their original models. Now that's old school. Something unique with the raiding in vanilla are resist fights. In your character sheet, you'll notice a selection of elemental resistances that you can stack. In these raids, there were a handful of fights that pretty much required a high resistance to a certain element. Fire resist is beneficial for Ragnaros, frost for Saffron, and nature for Huhuran. But the issue is that, especially in regards to nature resist, a lot of the required pieces were low level. Some you could find in Moradin, Razorfen Downs has some. So instead of using the updated Tier 2 models that we reviewed earlier and these other grand armaments, you would use this. You'd be able to kill the boss, yeah, but you don't really look that cool doing it. Hey, you know what? Give me my old gear back. I might be a corpse, but at least I'll look good. You can also, of course, obtain gear from PvP in this game through the rank 14 system, and overall they look pretty good. The Glorious Alliance plate, the Barbaric Horde leather, they do share models between armor types, but at least they look pretty decent, and most people agree with that. Well, everyone except for Tommy.
Like, I don't even understand what it is that I'm fighting. I don't understand why it is that I get my ass stomped by these fucking coneheads.
Overall, nothing really stands out as... Oh, good lord. He looks like a cabbage. My condolences in advance to any Alliance hunters out there, because this is the rare set that you eventually completed at rank 10, otherwise known as the Cabbage Patch Kid. Luckily, if you forgo bathing and break up with your non-existent girlfriend, the rank 13 epic set does actually look pretty nice, so maybe that'll serve as some motivation to make the push. As powerful as some of these items are, they're nothing compared to what's next. Items so strong that they never made it into the game and only exist in the files, either created as a joke or a reference, or intended to be released, but just never saw the light of day for one reason or another. They were only wieldable by Blizzard employees called Game Masters, or GMs. So next, we'll cover those and the interesting history behind them. From the game's launch, the idea of an authority figure being present was always interesting. An all-powerful being unrestricted by the rules that everyone else must follow. Many times in the race for world-first boss kills, GMs and developers will actually be present in the room watching the guild to try to claim the world first, and on the lookout for cheating or buggy mechanics. It's how Insidia got in trouble when they had used engineer grenades, and it glitched out the Lich King's platform mechanic in the world-first normal Lich King kill. It's like loading up a Game Genie and getting access to all of the ultimate abilities and items, walking through walls, or gaining access to restricted areas. I wonder what that would be like in the world of Warcraft, many players thought, and seeing a GM appear in the wild was an exciting thing. Many issues can be handled solely through text. In the game's early years, however, some issues required a more proactive approach, appearing before players in-game and showing off flashy effects, or wielding special items and armor. In the classic version of the game, you could sometimes seek them out instead. Some of you may have heard of GM Island, an in-game haven that serves as home for game masters hidden away far beyond Fatigue Waters. This is normally inaccessible to players, of course, but those clever and curious enough to find their way to the island would receive a swift ban if caught. The first noticeable item, however, would be the iconic blue and black robes. This is the attire of choice for every game master, a 3-piece set of a hood, a robe, and some slippers. And over the game's 15-year history, it's become iconic of the Game Master's look, even being used by Blizzard officially in various art on their website. Although it didn't seem to be a 100% requirement to wear it at all times, it would become a common sight whenever a GM chose to show themselves to the players. But there's much more than just armor. Next up we have the Warglaives of Azzinoth. No, not those ones. You of course had the legendary glaives from the Burning Crusade, which we covered earlier, but did you know that these existed all the way back during vanilla? It was only in the game files, perhaps planned at some point, but never released. They were of artifact quality, which is above even legendary. They boasted crazy DPS, crazy stats, crazy everything. Just to give you a comparison, the legendary Thunderfury had a DPS of 53, but these were a bit special because on use, you could combine the two glaives into an item called the Twin Blades of Azzinoth. Still a one-hander, but now holding a DPS of 143. It had shadow damage, agility, stamina, intellect, resistances, and a proc to unleash the Fury of Illidan, gaining 1400 attack power versus demons, 20% chance to hit, and 30% haste. Obviously, an item much too powerful to ever be released. Surely if it was, it would have been toned down quite a bit, which indeed was the case with the Burning Crusade expansion, when you looted them from Illidan Stormrage. And while the stats were a downgrade, the opposite was true for the visuals, most would agree. The originals were actually quite unique because they were the only glaives in the game files, although technically they were still of the sword weapon type. The glaive weapons were always a popular myth in early World of Warcraft, and players would try to hunt them down. So when these items came to light, people naturally freaked out, and they started searching the then dormant Dark Portal. But alas, the only way to obtain them were through GM commands, and players would have to wait a bit before they could get their hands on the official set. They weren't the only glaives though. There's also the deprecated Warden Blade and the Moon Glaive, and you also have the legendary Glaives of the Defender, which is more of a tanking item with a proc that reduces damage taken by 75%. Although again, these are technically of the sword type. It seems like there were plenty of plans for glaive weapons to have some sort of role in the game as early as vanilla, but players would have to wait until 2016 in Legion, as these ones again were only obtainable through GM commands. There are more there for NPCs to hold to make you envious. Next, we have one for all of the fishers out there. Throughout World of Warcraft's history, many collectible fishing poles were released. Whether it was the Arcanite fishing pole that you got from the weekly tournament in Stranglethorn, or the artifact, the Underlight Angler from Legion, it's always a goal for players to build the ultimate fishing set. The Holy Grail, however, would also be out of reach. Crafty's Pole is a legendary fishing rod released in patch 3.1 to serve as a tool for measuring the success chance of fishing with low skill versus high skill. It gave a whopping 1000 to the skill, and it held a pretty diesel DPS, even higher than that of Shadowmourne, and it also had some flavor text. Just holding the fishing pole makes you shiver with excitement. "This is possibly the most amazing thing you've ever seen." That's what she said. The Shard of the Defiler is another legendary item that never made it to the hands of the players. An incredibly fast dagger with some added shadow damage and a respectable 62 DPS, and a curious on-equip effect. The Defiler is a reference to Archimonde, the former ruler of Argus turned demon and lieutenant of Sargeras, the leader of the demon army, the Burning Legion, and this was another item data mined by players in classic World of Warcraft. It had the unique effect of turning your character model into an echo of Archimonde, as long as it was equipped. I made the mention of Shadowmourne earlier, the legendary two-handed axe from Wrath. As you recall, this was the sister blade of Frostmourne, which required the collection of legendary Shadowfrost shards, which were found from bosses in the heroic Icecrown Citadel raid. Being a weapon reserved only for the Lich King, Frostmourne was a bit too iconic in the lore to be wielded by the average player, but like many others on the list, if you're a GM, it's free game. 693 DPS, 4.0 speed, strength, intellect, stamina, socket, and on equip, the wielder of Frostmourne will become the new Lich King. Wait, I thought that was the Helmet of Dominion. Sounds like some bullcorn to me. And next we have the Tabard of Stormwind. No, not that one. This one was introduced in the Wrath of the Lich King as a way of grinding reputation, but there were plans for one all the way back in vanilla, and although they shared the same name, the look is a bit different, matching that of the Stormwind City Guard NPCs that you see throughout the city. In the beta of the game, you would receive this as a reward for rescuing Marshal Windsor from the Blackrock Depths and ousting Lady Prestor as Onyxia, but for unknown reasons, it was removed in the release and only obtainable through commands like many others on this list. So it's not the most major thing, but pretty interesting I thought, as the model is still unique to this day. Next we have Martin Fury, the only shirt in the game that has the plate armor type. It has a few stats, but more interesting in on-use effect. Kill all enemies in a 30-yard radius. This is obviously an item never intended to be in the hands of players, but somehow, someway, it found its way to a player's inventory. During the Wrath of the Lich King expansion, a player named Karate Chop had an issue with his character, so he paged a GM to restore his items, but by mistake, he was sent this item along with all of his other gear. So he did what any sane player would do. He took it to the next Ulduar raid with his guild and one-shot all of the bosses, claimed world first for everyone, and got himself banned and the rest of his raid group suspended for the 30-minute joyride, as the community saw for the first time what World of Warcraft was like with a game genie popped in. This item and all future GM items were immediately changed to instead kill the player, to serve as a failsafe if the same mistake were to be repeated. And you also have Martin's hotter cousin, Martin Thunder. This time, a weapon with ridiculous over-the-top stats, and the same on-use effect as Martin Fury that kills everything around you. This was nerfed alongside Martin Fury to Martin's Broken Staff, where once again it would kill the player. I'm not sure who Martin is, but he must have been pissed to log in to all of his gear getting nerfed due to other people abusing it. And next, we also have the fluorescent green Mechanostrider. One day, there's a player having trouble with his mount. He accidentally deleted it and paged a GM to restore it. Pretty run-of-the-mill. It was the green level 41, so the Game Master restored it and moved on. But, uh-oh, he made a mistake. Just like the Martin Fury incident, he had mistakenly given the player a different item, the fluorescent green Mechanostrider, which was unobtainable by players. Blizzard owned up to this blunder and surprisingly let the player keep the mount, making that person the only one in the entire game to own it. But it didn't last long, as they tried to sell their account and as a result were permanently banned from the game, once more making the fluorescent green Mechanostrider extinct. As I mentioned, GMs will oftentimes go out from their island into the world to aid players, and they prefer to do it in style. Peep's Whistle is the only legendary mount in the game, other than the black battle tank from the AQ40 opening event. It's the mount of choice for Game Masters, only obtainable through commands, but players can get the same model from the Ashes of Alar, which drops from Kael'thas Sunstrider in the Tempest Keep. Vanilla World of Warcraft for many represents a unique period of growth within the MMORPG genre. It's a time before uniqueness was sacrificed for the sake of balance, and while many say that results in a lot of wonky and broken crap, others say that it brings a bit of charm to the game. The itemization in vanilla, if nothing else, has some sort of lasting charm and are even referenced today either in retail or in various classic remakes. So in this video, we're going to cover some of the most interesting or unique or weird items in vanilla World of Warcraft. Each item on this list has earned its spot due to its iconic status within the game, or perhaps more so due to the interesting backstory behind them. First up, one of the rarest items in the game, even today, 20 years later, is the Contest Winner's Tabard. When the game first launched, it did so without an honor system, which was added a few months later. Before then, the only reason to PvP was for the fun of it and bragging rights, and for a short while, the Tabard. Blizzard held a contest between what would become an iconic PvP hotspot, Terran Mel versus South Shore in Hillsbrad, one of the first areas where the Alliance and Horde met. They held an event where the person with the most kills per server walked away with this special tabard. So seeing it out in the wild is incredibly rare, and consider yourself lucky if you ever do, as most of the few winners of this item have since quit. But it's definitely iconic. Believe it or not, the next item on our list is even more rare. In fact, only one person in the entire game has ever obtained it, and that's the Talisman of the Binding Shard. This was a legendary amulet that dropped off of the Gar boss within the Molten Core raid, and Blizzard had never intended for players to obtain it, but they forgot to remove it from the loot table. It was originally intended to be part of a quest related to constructing Thunderfury, but it was scrapped for some reason. One player, however, would be the lucky recipient, and that's Noctin of the Guild Nerfed. And once word spread, Blizzard quickly scrambled and they hotfixed it out of the game, but they did allow Noctin to keep his, which made him the only person to ever obtain it. The amulet had some physical DPS stats, resistances, and a Thorns effect, and it gave the player a lightning orb as a graphic, similar to the Shaman's lightning shield, making it the only amulet in the game that gave a visual effect at the time. Next up, we have the Skull of Impending Doom. This goes down as an item that, during original vanilla, when most people got it, they quickly vendored it, not knowing how immensely useful it is. This was a reward from a short quest chain that started in the Badlands Zone, which first sent you to Uldaman, and then to retrieve some reagents from elite enemies spread throughout the world. One from Stranglethorn, another from the Altric Mountains, and the last from the Dustwallow Marsh. It's an intellect offhand weapon, which when used, increased your run speed by 60% for 10 seconds, but also drained health and mana during the duration. Aside from the speed boost, this would be very useful in PvP, as the damage inflicted could actually be useful in breaking crowd control effects, such as sheep, or sap, or hunter traps. Crowd control, as many people know, was incredibly powerful in vanilla, as it was before they were limited to 11 seconds, so anything to counter that was quite crucial. In fact, this item was so powerful that some players who had vendored it would actually remake their characters. And this is even the nerfed version. The original just dealt a set amount of small damage, scaled to its level 41 eye level, and it was only after it was popularized by a prolific PvPer, Swifty, that it caught the attention of Blizzard, where it was quickly nerfed. And later in the Burning Crusade, it was made to be even more punishing, draining 60% health and mana over time on use. But it's definitely one of Vanilla's most defining items, at least within the PvP realm. This next one is for all of the twinks out there, in-game that is, or in real life too, if that's your thing, whatever, it's for everyone. And it's what is probably the most iconic twink weapon to ever exist, and that's the Pendulum of Doom. For those who may be confused, let's go over a little history. When Battlegrounds were first released, they were split up into different brackets, and that's 10 to 19, 20 to 29, and so on, all the way up to 50 to 59, with 60 having its own bracket. So while this was done to ensure that queues were relatively active, no matter what level you were, a side effect was that people would make what were called twinks, which were characters who stayed at the maximum level for that bracket, and then deck them out with the best gear and consumables possible. Compared to a normal, innocent, poor quester, these characters were many times more powerful, and it would become popular enough that the winner of these battlegrounds would essentially be the side with the most twinks. And while there were many highly powerful weapons to be found, one of the most iconic would become the Pendulum of Doom. which was a level 39 two-handed axe found within the Uldaman dungeon. 39 DPS, a hefty proc, and perhaps most importantly, an extremely slow 4.0 speed, which was important because many attacks in the game were based off of weapon damage, so the slower the weapon, the higher the damage and the higher the specials, and the more potential for burst in general. And with it being right at the top of the level bracket at 39, it would hold the best possible stats. But aside from its strength, what made the weapon iconic was its extreme rarity, having just a 0.02% chance to drop from just a handful of mobs within the dungeon. So, because of this, it would become one of the most expensive items throughout vanilla and future expansions until in Cataclysm when XP was added to the battlegrounds, which would essentially kill the Twinking community. But even still, it would always fetch a high price for collectors. Next up, we have the Headmaster's Handguards. Seems innocent enough. Level 44 mail gloves, purple, increased skill with axes, daggers, and swords by 7 each. Just a weird vanilla item, but oddly enough, this would become one of the best pairs of gloves in the game for most warriors until they reach the final raid tier, Naxxramas. Weapon skill, as it turned out, was one of the most important DPS stats in vanilla World of Warcraft, and it has to do with the glancing blow mechanic. This is a combat dynamic where the weapon skill of an attacker is equated against the defense of its target. The larger disparity in favor of the target's defense, the more glancing blows will occur, which are sort of like the opposite of crits. They're attacks which have heavily reduced damage or are otherwise mitigated through parries and dodges and stuff. So, since for each level, the maximum cap of these stats raises by 5, a level 60 attacking a level 60 typically results in an even match of weapon skill versus defense. But by equipping these gloves, the player is given an advantage in weapon skill, and therefore they perform fewer glancing blows as well as critting and hitting more. It's because of this is why humans and orcs are by and large to be seen as the best in raiding in vanilla World of Warcraft due to their weapon skill ratios. But for those who opted for other races, these gloves would be highly sought after as they were a huge DPS increase. And similarly, in the same vein, next up on our list we have the Hungering Cold. 73 DPS, 1.5 speed, armor, stamina, and most importantly, sword skill. This is dropped from the final boss of the game, Quel'Serrar, and it would become one of the best swords for both rogues and warriors. But what really earns it a spot on this list isn't its power, nor even its difficulty to get, but rather its model. In 2006, a popular cartoon series, South Park, made an episode about World of Warcraft. The boys were getting harassed by a hacker terrorizing the game world, and the only way to stop him, as foretold by a developer named Saltzman, was by obtaining a weapon called the Sword of 1,000 Truths. This episode would quickly become one of the series' most popular, even to this day, and while this weapon didn't actually exist in the game, it used the same model as the Hungering Cold. And in fact, when Naxxramas was re-released in the Wrath of the Lich King expansion, this model would make a return with the Slayer of the Lifeless weapon, which held the flavor text, as foretold by Saltzman. Owing more to their uniqueness from their rarity, next up we have a triple, and that's the Collector's Edition pets. With each expansion launch, you're typically offered a few options in purchasing the game. The Standard Edition, the Deluxe Edition, and the Collector's. When World of Warcraft first launched in 2004, no one really knew just how popular it would become, not even Blizzard. So because of this, the amount of collector's editions that they made was comparatively very low by today's standards. This would not only make these copies themselves extremely rare and highly sought after today, but also the rewards they held. Owners of these editions, as a reward for their support, were offered one of 3 unique pets of their choice, which was the Zergling from their StarCraft series, the Mini Diablo from Diablo, and also a Panda Cub. These pets were never re-released, nor re-implemented into the game, not even today, 20 years later, making them extremely rare to witness out in the wild. And the only way to obtain them today is to either buy the code or a sealed collector's edition entirely, both of which fetch outrageously high prices. Throughout World of Warcraft's 20-year run, there have been hundreds of mounts of all varieties added to the game. Some are more coveted than others, of course, usually due to their looks or rarity, but the next item on our list had both, and that's the Death Charger's Reins. Deep within the Stratholme dungeon on the undead side, players could find the boss Baron Rivendare, who sits atop his undead steed. Earlier we talked about the Pendulum of Doom and its extreme rarity, holding just a 0.02% chance to drop from a selection of level 40 mobs. And though the drop rate for this mount was eventually buffed to 0.1% in the retail version of the game, in vanilla it had just a 0.01% chance to drop, and it was off just one level 60 enemy, the Baron himself. So while most people farm him for his tier 0 and a selection of pre-rating best in slot, everyone also carries a very small hope that he'll drop one of the rarest mounts ever. Next up on our list, we have the Blade of Eternal Darkness. This is another boss drop, this time from the final boss of the Moradin dungeon, Princess Theridris. A much higher drop rate on this one compared to some of the others, at 2%, but it would eventually become a highly sought after item, particularly by mages due to its proc, which had a chance to deal shadow damage and return mana on a spell hit. Although this was quite powerful in its own right, it would especially shine within the boosting community that took over the 2019 re-release of the game, where mages gather up a bunch of mobs within a dungeon and then AoE them down all at once. Some farms would be made far easier, and some even straight up required it, as it would essentially give mages infinite mana. Boosting itself would become a highly controversial aspect of the game, as it was intertwined deeply with RMT, as well as hurting the social aspect of the game, as many were able to sit AFK in dungeons to level to 60. Next up, we have a pretty iconic piece of vanilla history, and that's Timalane's Phylactery. This has to do with the Ashbringer story, which I've covered recently before, so I'll try to keep it short here. As big as vanilla was, there's quite a lot of content that was left on the cutting room floor, one of which being the Ashbringer questline. Within the final raid of the game, Extramus, players could loot the corrupted Ashbringer from its wielder, Alexandros Mograine. This on its own is quite a memorable weapon, but little did many know it was destined for greater things, as evidenced by its unique properties. If players took it into the cathedral wing of the Scarlet Monastery dungeon, a special event would trigger where the cult becomes friendly, and they make comments towards the wielder, culminating with a special event where the ghost of Alexandros smites his son. Talking to the hidden Inquisitor Fairbanks, he references that there may be a way to cleanse the legendary weapon, and that the answer lies within Mograine's other lost son, who is residing in the Outland. As history has shown, the Outland would eventually see its release in the game's first expansion, the Burning Crusade, but it was originally planned to be in the base version of the game. It was removed due to a lack of time, and along with it, the path to cleansing the corrupted Ashbringer. However, partly due to the legendary version existing within the game files, this didn't stop the players from rampantly scouring the world in search of a way to do so, and eventually, in desperation, they would turn their focus on the next item on our list, Timalane's Phylactery. A phylactery is a scroll of incantations that holds the soul of a lich, which is an undead enemy type in the game. Kel'Thuzad, for example, is a lich. Timalane's Phylactery dropped from large vile slimes, which were found in the Weeping Cave in the Western Plagueland Zone. In his life, he was a swordsmith for the Scarlet Crusade, and at one point he was tasked with crafting the weapon for High Lord Mograine, and upon doing so he was killed and fed to the oozes within the Plaguelands. And the only issue was that this item had seemingly no use. There wasn't a quest associated with it, it wasn't used as a reagent for anything, so it left players scratching their head as to what its intended purpose was, and with his link to the Scarlet Crusade and a Mograine, eventually players had determined that it was somehow linked to cleansing the Ashbringer and bringing it to its true form. They would take it to the Scarlet Monastery, Extramus, and all corners of the world, hoping that there existed a secret event like the one that was found within the monastery when holding the Ashbringer. However, the boring truth was that it was all a mistake. At some point there had been a quest associated with the phylactery, but it was cut, and when Blizzard removed the quest, they forgot to remove the item associated with it, and in the process of doing so, this one simple mistake led an entire community on one of the most time-wasting goose chases in video game history. The whole debacle was referenced many years later in the Legion expansion with the hidden artifact appearance for the Ashbringer artifact weapon. Earlier we covered the Headmaster's handguards, an item that, despite its low level, ended up being one of the most powerful in the entire game. Another one can be found from a level 4 quest in the starting zone for humans, and that's the Bag of Marbles. On use, decreases a target's chance to hit by 25% with 10 charges. At this point in the game, this and many other low-level quest rewards didn't diminish in effectiveness against higher-level enemies. Even raid bosses were usually susceptible to them, and the Bag of Marbles provided a great way to mitigate damage in an emergency. It's one of those items that you hold on to for a rainy day, with many guilds usually opting to save it for their first few kills of Patchwork and Extramus, who has very high physical damage. If enough raiders have it, you can rotate them throughout the fight and essentially give your tank a 25% chance for a missed hit. When mentioning useful low-level rewards, it's almost impossible to not mention the Light of a Loon. This was another Alliance-only item. It is the reward for a level 20 quest in the Ashenville zone, providing immunity to all damage for 10 seconds upon use for one single time. Unlike other immunity effects in the game, this one doesn't pacify you, which made it extremely powerful. It's become especially useful for the game's recent hardcore mode, which has permanent character death. Since it lasts for exactly 10 seconds, you can macro it with your Hearth, which gives you an extra life. And since we just mentioned PvP, we also have to mention one of the most powerful and one of the most competitive items in the entire game, and that's the Title Charm. On use, stuns the target for 3 seconds, 15-minute cooldown, usable from 30 yards. My girlfriend agrees. 3 seconds is a lot, and with it being range, it fills out the toolkit of pretty much every class in the game. Aside from the insignias, it's arguably the best PvP trinket, so of course it also has to be the most annoying to obtain. It drops off of the rare Prince Nazjack mob, who resides underwater within the level 30 Arathi Highland zone, and he has a respawn timer of around 2 days. He's horrendously cammed 24/7, even on PvE servers, and it's only a 50% drop chance, so only the very few most dedicated or lucky or crazy players ever see this coveted trinket. World of Warcraft's 20-year legacy is filled with unforgettable battles, epic adventures, and weapons and armor that have become more than just gear. They're a part of our stories, whether it was the thrill of finally looting that legendary drop, or grinding for weeks to earn an armor set that felt uniquely yours, or simply admiring the sheer craftsmanship or lore behind these iconic tools of war. Each of the items in this video represent a piece of the game's enduring magic, and it's been my pleasure to share it with you. I hope you found the video entertaining. Like it if you liked it, because I'll definitely see you in the next one. Peace.
Farewell for now, mortals. We hope you enjoyed today's video. See you again soon.